In 2005, a man named Eric Martin was working his shift at a paper mill in Maine. He'd been at that same mill for 20 years, a long time. It was a normal day, and he was reaching up to get something off a high shelf when he felt a sharp, sudden pain in his back. It was bad. He had slipped a number of discs, and the injury was severe enough that it completely changed his life. The doctors told him he wasn't going to be able to work anymore. He was going to be on disability. And just like that, after 2 decades of the same routine, Eric was out of a job. His wife, Shelley Martin, hadn't been working at the time. She was raising their family. But with Eric's income gone, she knew she had to find a job, and fast. It wasn't easy, since she'd been out of the workforce for a long time. But through some connections, she managed to land a position in her old hometown, a small rural community in Maine called Palmyra. When I say small, I mean really small. We're talking about maybe 1,200 people living there. It was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, surrounded by miles and miles of dense forest. The Martins also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea. Understandably, she wasn't thrilled about the idea of leaving her friends and her school to move to a tiny town in the middle of nowhere. But the family didn't have a choice. Palmyra was the only place they could afford to live on their new, much tighter budget. But there was a silver lining. Because the cost of living was so much lower in Palmyra, they were actually able to get a bigger piece of property than what they had before. They found this beautiful old farmhouse that sat on a huge plot of land, several acres of it. The catch was, it was incredibly isolated. To even get to the house, you had to drive down a long, bumpy access road that led to their own private driveway. And once you were on the property, if you looked in any direction, all you could see was a 360-degree view of thick, dark woods. There were no hiking trails, no other houses in sight. It was just them and the forest. So, even though nobody was particularly excited about the move, they packed up their lives and headed to the new farmhouse. As they were unloading the truck, Eric picked up one of his many rifles. Eric came from a long line of hunters. It was more than a hobby for him, it was a huge part of his identity. He loved being out in the woods, and he had a whole collection of guns he used for hunting. But as he started to carry a rifle into the house, Shelley stopped him. She said, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house." This had always been a point of conflict in their marriage. Shelley just never felt comfortable having firearms inside the home, especially with their daughter living there. She told Eric, "You have a barn. You can put your guns in the barn." After some discussion, Eric finally agreed. He went out to the barn with his son Sean, who had come over to help them with the move. Together, they built a heavy-duty gun case for all of Eric's rifles. They made it solid and secure. They put the case inside the barn, locked the case itself, and then locked the barn door. The guns were definitely safe and secure out there, but they were also not easy to get to in a hurry. Over that first year living in the farmhouse, Eric and Shelley settled into a new routine. At the end of each day, they would make coffee and go sit out on the front porch together. They'd just sit there, sipping their coffee and talking, looking out over their front yard and the big open field that stretched out towards the tree line. It was a quiet, peaceful ritual that they both came to look forward to every single night. Fast forward almost exactly 1 year, it was early 2006. Eric and Shelley were on their front porch, having their nightly coffee, just chatting like they always did. The sun had gone down, and it was getting dark. As they sat there, Shelley noticed something. Way out at the edge of the woods, she saw a light. To understand what she was seeing, you have to picture the layout of their property. Right in front of the porch was a gravel area where they parked their cars. About 20 meters or so to the left was the big barn. Straight ahead from the porch was the huge, open field. It was like a grazing area with no trees. And then, hundreds of meters away, at the far end of that field, was the beginning of that dense, dark forest. The light Shelley saw was way out there, at the tree line. She described it as a pulsating light. It didn't look like headlights from a car, and besides, there was no road out there. It was just the edge of the woods. Eric saw it too, and his first thought was that it was a poacher. Someone was on his property, hunting illegally. He was not happy about it. He called for his son, Sean, who happened to be staying the night. He brought Sean outside and pointed toward the tree line. He asked him, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there?" Sean looked and said he wasn't sure, but it could be. Eric decided he wanted to go down there and tell whoever it was to get off his land. He asked Sean to come with him. Their plan was simple. They would just walk to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property. You need to leave." So the two of them started walking across the big, open field, heading straight for the distant tree line. As they got closer, they noticed that the pulsating lights began to fade. The lights seemed to be retreating back into the woods, deeper into the darkness. By the time Eric and Sean reached the edge of the forest, the lights were completely gone. Even though they were pretty sure the poacher had left, they decided to be thorough. They thought, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods and keep yelling. That way, whoever it was would definitely get the message. So they stepped into the forest. It was pitch black under the canopy of trees. The woods were very dense, with lots of low-hanging branches. It wasn't an easy place to walk. There were no paths or trails at all. They walked maybe 10 or 15 meters into the darkness, continuing to call out that this was private land. And then they both stopped. They heard a sound. It sounded like someone or something was walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away, off to their left. They could hear the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs. They both froze and looked in that direction, but they couldn't see anything in the dark. They didn't want to take any chances. They didn't know if they were being stalked by a mountain lion or some other predator. Eric and Sean looked at each other, and without saying much, they decided it was time to get out of there. The lights were gone, and they didn't like the idea of whatever was making that noise being so close to them in the dark. They turned around and quickly made their way back to the farmhouse. About a month went by after that strange night. It was now spring, and the first really nice weekend after a long, dark Maine winter had finally arrived. Chelsea's boyfriend, Nathan, was staying with the family at the farm. Feeling cooped up, Chelsea and Nathan decided it would be a perfect day to go for a walk in the woods. They took the family's two dogs and started walking across that same big field in front of the house, heading towards the same section of forest where Eric and Sean had seen the lights. At first, Chelsea had the dogs on their leashes. But once they got into the woods, she let them off so they could run around and burn off some energy. The two dogs immediately took off, running full speed for about 100 meters into the forest. Then, suddenly, they both came to a dead stop. They were standing right in front of a big mound. From a distance, it just looked like a pile of dirt. But as Chelsea and Nathan got closer, they could see it was something more. It looked like some kind of den. Huge pieces of wood had been leaned against each other to create a sort of lean-to structure. The entire outside of it was covered with moss and dirt and grass, making it blend in with the forest floor. It looked like it had been built very intentionally. On the front of the mound, there was a circular hole, like an entrance. The two dogs had stopped right at this entrance, and they were cautiously poking their heads in and sniffing. Chelsea and Nathan stood there looking at this strange structure. They wondered who could have built it. Was it something a hunter would make, like a blind? Or could an animal have made it? It seemed way too big and complex for any normal animal they could think of. But it was definitely made on purpose. Nathan, being curious, leaned down and tried to peer into the dark hole. He couldn't see anything inside, but he thought he heard a low growling sound coming from deep within the den. That was enough for him. Without a second of hesitation, he stood up and said to Chelsea, "We have to go." "I don't know what's living in there, but we need to get out of here," They quickly put the dogs back on their leashes and hurried out of the forest as fast as they could. When they got back to the house, they told Eric and Shelley what they had found. Sean happened to be there that day too. They described the strange man-made den they had discovered deep in the woods. As soon as they mentioned where they found it, straight out from the front porch, Eric and Sean looked at each other. That's when they told Chelsea and Nathan about their own experience a month earlier, about the lights and how they could have sworn they heard some large animal stalking them in that exact same area. The pieces of this strange puzzle were starting to come together, and none of them liked the picture it was forming. A couple of months passed. Life on the farm went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. One evening, Eric and Shelley were out on their front porch doing their coffee ritual. It was a cool night, and a low mist was hanging over the entire field, giving the property a slightly creepy vibe. As they were sitting there, they commented to each other about how spooky it looked. But then, their casual conversation took a turn. They both realized at the same time that they couldn't hear any wildlife. There were no crickets chirping, no frogs, no sounds of animals in the woods. Normally, at night, the air was humming with the sounds of nature. But on this night, it was dead silent. Shelley had this high-powered flashlight that she always kept with her on the porch. Feeling uneasy, she picked it up and started scanning the property with the beam. She swept the light across the field, over the barn, and along the tree line. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but the silence was just too odd. After scanning the whole area and seeing nothing, she put the flashlight down and went back to talking with Eric. Eric would later say in interviews that for some reason, the moment she put that flashlight down, a powerful feeling of danger washed over him. He was looking out into the misty darkness, and even though he couldn't see anything, every instinct in his body was screaming that something was wrong. All of a sudden, he turned to Shelley and said, "You know what? We need to go inside." "I don't know what it is, but we need to go inside right now." Shelley was a bit surprised. She said, "Come on, I want to stay out here a little longer. We'll go in a few minutes." But Eric was insistent. He stood up and said, "No, go inside." He tried to grab her arm to gently push her towards the door, but she was still resisting a little. And then, in that moment, Shelley stopped. She froze and whispered, "Did you hear that?" Eric immediately knew that whatever she heard was the reason for his sudden feeling of dread. He turned and looked out into the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. Shelley grabbed her flashlight again and started scanning the tree line. She moved the beam across the field, and when it got about halfway across, right in front of them, she stopped. Because right there in the middle of the field, illuminated by the flashlight's beam, were 3 creatures. They looked like massive wolves. They were just standing there, staring directly at them. And as they watched, 2 more joined them. Now, there were 5 of these huge wolf-like creatures all lined up in the field, all looking right at the porch. Shelley turned to Eric, her voice trembling, and asked, "What are those?" Eric, an experienced hunter who knew all the animals in the Maine woods, had no idea. He said, "I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We have to go inside." Shelley kept the light on them, frozen in fear. And then the creatures started charging. They ran directly at the porch, moving so incredibly fast that Shelley couldn't even keep the beam of light on them. They were already halfway across the field in a matter of seconds. Eric and Shelley scrambled inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Without even speaking a word to each other, they both went on a mission. They moved through the entire bottom floor of the house, locking every single window and closing every blind. They made sure everything was shut and secured. There was something about these 5 creatures that was different. The way they had charged at them, it didn't feel like a random animal encounter. It felt targeted. It felt like they were after them specifically. So even after the house was locked down, they didn't feel safe. They stood in the middle of their living room, and Eric's mind immediately went to his guns. He said, "My guns are in the barn. We have no protection in here. Shelley immediately told him, whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what those things are. Don't you dare go out there. Shelley then ran upstairs. She went through the second floor, shutting off all the lights and making sure every window was locked tight. Then she went to her daughter Chelsea's room. She woke her up gently and said, "Hey, come here. You have to look at this." They crept over to Chelsea's window. They didn't want to open the blinds all the way because they were terrified the creatures would see them. So they just peeked through a small crack. Shelley whispered, "Look." And there, standing on the gravel path right in front of the house, were the 5 creatures. They were just standing in a perfect row, looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting. It was like they knew Eric and Shelley were inside and were just patiently waiting for them to come back out. It was not normal animal behavior at all. As Shelley and Chelsea watched, one of the creatures slowly looked up right at the window where they were hiding. And then the creature stood up on its 2 hind legs. Shelley gasped and stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The creature was enormous. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. Shelley was on the ground, looking up at Chelsea, her mind unable to process what she had just seen. How could it have even seen them? They were barely peeking out the window. And how could it stand up on 2 legs like that? And why were they all just sitting in a row outside their house, waiting? What was happening? Shelley pulled herself together and told Chelsea, "Get in your bed. Do not go near your windows. Do not leave this room." And that's when Shelley realized she hadn't heard their 2 dogs bark once during all of this. She started to worry that they might have been left outside. She began walking quietly through the upstairs rooms, calling their names softly. The dogs didn't come. Finally, she went into the master bedroom, and she found them. The 2 dogs were huddled together in the corner of the room, trembling. They looked completely terrified by whatever was outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs. He felt utterly helpless. He needed to get his guns from the barn to protect his family. But he knew it was a huge risk. With his bad back, he couldn't move very fast. He'd have to cross the open yard, unlock the barn, then pull down the heavy gun case and unlock that, all while being completely exposed to those creatures. He decided there had to be another way. He thought maybe he could run outside, get into his truck, and back it right up to the front door. Then he could get Shelley and Chelsea to run out and jump in, and they could just drive away. He went to a window and carefully pulled the blinds aside, just enough to look outside. The 5 creatures were gone. They were no longer standing on the gravel path. He couldn't see them anywhere. He let the blinds fall back into place. He thought, well, I don't know where they are, so it's still too dangerous to go out there. He started pacing again, his mind racing. After a few minutes, he went back to the window and looked again. This time, he saw them. They were back in the field where he and Shelley had first spotted them. All 5 of them were visible because the moon had come out from behind the clouds, illuminating the whole field. They were still facing the house. Eric thought, okay, maybe this is my chance. If I can keep my eye on them, maybe I can open the door, run to the truck, and back it up before they even notice me. So, without telling Shelley what he was about to do, he quietly unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. He could see them clearly out in the field. They hadn't moved. As quietly as he could, he walked down the porch steps and started making his way across the gravel towards his truck, which was parked about 10 meters away. He kept his eyes locked on the creatures in the field. They still hadn't moved. They apparently hadn't seen him. He reached the driver's side of his truck. He had his keys in his hand and was fumbling to find the unlock button. And then it happened. The motion sensor security light attached to his house kicked on, flooding the entire area with bright light. He was so on edge that the sudden light startled him, and he dropped his keys. The first thing he did was look towards the field. He saw that one of the 5 creatures was now standing on its hind legs, looking directly at him. Before he could even bend down to get his keys, he saw all 5 of them start running towards him at full speed. He dove down, grabbed his keys, and ran for the house as fast as his injured back would allow. He slammed the door shut just as he heard them crossing the gravel right behind him. He heard their heavy bodies bound onto the front porch, and then the sound of them running around the wraparound porch. He was too scared to even look through the window, so he just ducked down to get out of sight. Shelley, who was upstairs, heard all the commotion and yelled down, "Eric, what's going on?" He just yelled back, "Stay up there! Stay up there!" The entire family was frozen. Eric, Shelley, and Chelsea were all just listening, knowing that those creatures were right on the other side of the wall, walking along their porch. After what felt like an eternity, he heard their footsteps leave the porch and go back onto the gravel. At some point, he finally got the courage to peek his head up and look out the window. All 5 of them were sitting there, again, right in front of the house, just facing it, as if they were waiting. Eric scurried up the stairs to where Shelley and Chelsea were. They were all terrified. They decided they had no choice but to call the police. They figured, if nothing else, a police car driving up with its lights on might be enough to scare the creatures away. Shelley made the call. On the phone, she tried to explain that they were scared of something on their property. She said there were 5 creatures, things, running around outside their house. The police officer on the other end of the line was immediately skeptical. He asked, "All right, ma'am, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear?" Shelley insisted it wasn't. She pleaded, "Can you please just come over here?" But the officer just said, "Listen, ma'am, just keep your doors and windows shut. I'm sure it'll be fine." And that's how the call ended. They were completely on their own. The family felt helpless. Eric, in particular, was frustrated and angry. He couldn't protect his family. He couldn't get to his weapons. He couldn't get to his truck. They were trapped. They decided the only thing they could do was barricade themselves inside the house. For the next 30 minutes, they worked together, pushing heavy furniture in front of all the doors and windows on the ground floor. They blocked everything as best they could. They went to the kitchen and gathered knives, and they found an axe they used for chopping firewood. With their makeshift weapons, they went upstairs and locked themselves in the master bedroom with their 2 dogs. They all got on the bed together. They decided all they could do now was wait for the sun to come up. During the time they were barricading the house, they had looked out the window from time to time. And each time, they saw the 5 creatures just sitting on the gravel area, waiting for them. But as soon as they finally went upstairs and locked themselves in the bedroom, they heard the creatures move. They heard at least a couple of them walk back onto the porch, and then it was totally silent except for the sounds of these creatures. It was clear they were communicating with each other. They would make strange howling and bumping sounds. It sounded like they were trying to coordinate some kind of attack on the house. The way the farmhouse was built, the second floor was a bit smaller than the first floor. This meant the first floor had its own separate roof that you could walk on right below the second floor windows. After a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They heard silence, and then they heard a loud thud. They had jumped onto that first floor roof. The scary thing about this was that from that roof, you could walk right up to the second floor windows and look inside. So the family was lying there in the dark, listening. Periodically, they would hear them walking on the roof right outside their bedroom. There were windows on either side of the room they were in, with only thin curtains covering them. From time to time, one of the creatures would walk past their window and stop. They would hear it put its paws up on the window glass, and they could see its dark silhouette through the thin curtain. It was looking inside. All night long, they listened to these creatures running around on their roof. Sometimes they would hear a loud, violent scratching sound, as if they had found a weak spot and were trying to claw their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke through the glass. They never got inside. As the first light of dawn started to break on the horizon, the creatures jumped off the roof. The family could hear them running away back towards the forest. For about an hour, they sat in the room listening. They didn't hear anything else. The sun was up now, and they finally felt like it might be safe. They unlocked the bedroom door, went downstairs, and carefully moved the furniture away from the front door. They opened it up and stepped outside. All over their property, there was evidence of what had happened. There were massive footprints in the soft dirt, footprints with huge claw marks at the end of them. They found tufts of dark hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier, they found all these spots on the house where the creatures had clearly tried to get in. The siding on the second floor, right by the windows, was shredded with deep scratch marks. The front door had been scratched to pieces. It was undeniable that whatever these creatures were, they had been trying very hard to get inside the house. But for some reason, they had been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the Martin family that they couldn't stay there. They put the house up for sale and they moved away as quickly as they could. They have never experienced anything like that since they left that isolated farmhouse in Palmyra. So what do you think those creatures were? Were they bears or wolves, or were they something else entirely? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of the 8th of December, 1995, 41-year-old Bonnie Sanborn walked through her Tucson, Arizona home, believing she was dealing with the biggest problem in her life. She had no idea that within the next 24 hours, she would vanish from her own bedroom in one of the most violent crimes the city had seen that year. At the time, though, the morning felt ordinary. Her youngest son was already sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. The television hummed softly somewhere in the house. Sunlight spilled through the windows. Bonnie moved down the hallway with a cup of coffee in her hand, trying to get her children ready for school before the morning chaos got any worse. She stopped briefly at her daughter Candace's room, reminding the 13-year-old to hurry up. Candace barely looked up from the mirror. Bonnie sighed and continued farther down the hallway toward her 15-year-old son Bradley's bedroom. The door was shut. And behind it, Bonnie was about to discover something so bizarre, so alarming, that it would completely change the course of the next 24 hours. She knocked on his door, a solid, firm knock. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time, and called his name. Still nothing. She raised her voice, shouting through the closed door that if he didn't get out of that bed, she was coming in there to drag him out herself. It was a threat she'd made before, but today she really meant it. Yet, there was still no response from inside the room. A flicker of worry mixed with her frustration. She pressed her ear against the cool wood of the door, listening for any sign of movement. She was hoping to hear the rustle of sheets or the sound of a dresser drawer opening and closing. But that's not what she heard. Instead, a strange sound reached her ears. It was a rhythmic clanking noise, a harsh metallic sound, like someone was banging metal against metal over and over again. It was completely out of place for a quiet suburban morning. Her curiosity and concern now overriding her anger, Bonnie turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her made her stop dead in her tracks. There, in the middle of his bedroom floor, was her son, Bradley. And with him was his 18-year-old friend, Jason Horbachevsky. The two of them were crouched on the floor, sweat beading on their foreheads, using a crowbar and a hammer to try and pry open a large, heavy metal box. Bonnie stepped fully into the room, her eyes wide with disbelief. As she got a closer look, she realized what the box was. There was a phone receiver dangling off the side, its coiled cord twisted and broken. It was a payphone. A payphone that Bradley and Jason had very obviously stolen from somewhere on the street, and now they were trying to smash it open to get the quarters from inside. Bonnie was so completely shocked, so floored by the brazenness of it all, that the only words she could manage to get out were a quiet, "What are you doing?" Bradley looked up at his mom, his expression not one of guilt or fear, but of mild annoyance that he'd been interrupted. He just shrugged and said, "What?" "We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." As if it were the most normal thing in the world. Before Bonnie could even begin to process his response, his friend Jason looked over his shoulder at her. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He just grinned and started laughing, a strange, hollow laugh that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. The complete lack of shame from either of them was what truly stunned her. At this point, Bonnie felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She slowly backed out of the room and stood in the hallway, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do here? Her son was committing a felony right here in her house in the middle of the morning. It was so blatant, so defiant. She knew she'd been having problems with Bradley for a long time. This wasn't the first time she had caught him doing something he shouldn't. He was known to throw huge unauthorized parties at the house whenever she wasn't home. He was constantly picking fights with his siblings, with her, with just about everyone. And she knew, though he tried to hide it, that he was spending time with known gang members. For a long time, Bonnie had tried her best to be understanding. She remembered how difficult it was being a teenager, the pressures, the confusion. She tried to be supportive, to talk to him, to guide him. But his behavior just kept getting worse. The trouble was escalating, and this stolen payphone in his bedroom, felt like a breaking point. It was a line that had been crossed, a big one. She knew in her gut that if she let this slide, if she just yelled at him and let it go, he would just keep pushing the boundaries. He would keep going further and further until he got himself seriously hurt, or hurt someone else, or ended up in prison. This was the moment. She had to put her foot down, hard. So, without saying another word to Bradley or Jason, who had already gone back to hammering and prying at the metal box, she turned around. She walked with a determined stride back down the hallway, through the living room, and into the kitchen. Her other two children, Brandon and Candace, were now both at the table, eating their cereal and looking annoyed by the loud banging coming from their brother's room. Bonnie walked right past them, her face set like stone. She picked up the kitchen phone from its cradle on the wall and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Bonnie's voice was steady as she said she wanted to report a theft. And then she gave the dispatcher her own address. After she hung up the phone, she turned to Candace and Brandon and told them to go get their backpacks and wait outside for the school bus. She didn't want them to see what was about to happen. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. Bonnie opened it to find two sheriff's deputies standing on her porch. She recognized both of them, and she could tell from their expressions that they recognized her too. This wasn't the first time law enforcement had been called to the Sanborn house. They had been there several times in recent months to deal with domestic disputes, most of which were started by Bradley. As she led them inside, Bonnie felt a deep sense of failure. She was trying so hard to keep her family together, but it felt like it was falling apart at the seams. And it wasn't just Bradley. She was starting to see some of that same rebelliousness in Candace, who was acting out more and more lately. And she worried constantly about what would happen when her sweet little Brandon became a teenager. Would he follow in his older siblings' footsteps? She just didn't understand what she was doing wrong. Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room. When they walked in, Bradley and Jason were still on the floor, completely engrossed in their work on the payphone. They hadn't even noticed the deputies arrive. When Bradley finally looked up and saw the two uniformed officers standing in his doorway, his face twisted in fury. He jumped to his feet and started screaming at his mother, yelling that he couldn't believe she had called the cops on him, on her own son. But Bonnie, steeling herself, pushed down the guilt that was clawing at her. She had to do this. For his own good. The deputies were calm and professional. They handcuffed both Bradley and Jason and led them out of the house. Bonnie followed close behind them, watching as they put the two teenagers in the back of the squad car. As one of the officers was about to close the door, Bonnie pulled him aside. She asked him, her voice low so the boys couldn't hear, if he could please make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. It felt like a terrible thing for a mother to ask, basically demanding that her own child be locked up. But she was desperate. She hoped that a night in juvenile hall would scare him straight. She also knew they offered counseling services there, and maybe, just maybe, someone could get through to him in a way she couldn't. The deputy nodded sympathetically and said he would see what he could do. As the squad car pulled away from the curb and drove down the street, Bonnie saw a curtain twitch in the window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw one of her neighbors peering out, trying to get a look at all the commotion. Further down the block, a couple who had been out for a morning jog had slowed to a walk and were now openly staring. Bonnie felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She knew the people in this neighborhood were already well aware of her family's struggles. It was impossible to hide. And it made it all so much worse because, to her face, her neighbors were generally nice. Some even went out of their way to offer help. But she wasn't naive. She knew that behind closed doors, behind her back, her family was the subject of constant gossip. It was humiliating and it was frustrating, but more than anything, it made her feel incredibly isolated. Her husband, Robert, was supposed to be her partner in all of this, but he had taken a job in Maryland and was only able to come home every other weekend. She had thought about selling the house in Tucson and moving the whole family out to be with him, but with the kids' behavior, the logistics just seemed overwhelming. The good news was that Robert had been talking to his boss about a transfer back to Tucson. He was supposed to be coming home for good next week. Bonnie was just trying to hold on until then. She was trying to survive. She felt so alone, but she kept telling herself that soon Robert would be back. He would be there to help her deal with the kids, the nosy neighbors, the police. Having her partner by her side would make all the difference. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 that night, Bonnie stood in her bathroom brushing her teeth. The house was finally quiet, a rare and welcome peace. The only sound was the low hum of the television coming from the living room. She had gotten a call from the juvenile detention center earlier that afternoon. Bradley was being held on theft charges, which Bonnie believed was for the best. His friend Jason, however, was 18, an adult in the eyes of the law. He wasn't held in custody. He was just given a ticket and released that same day. Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley got out, he and Jason would be right back together, getting into the same old trouble. It was a discouraging thought. Before she went to her own room, Bonnie walked into the living room. Her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were sprawled out on the couch, their eyes glued to the TV. She told them it was time for bed, that they needed to turn off the television and go to their rooms. But they just ignored her, completely absorbed in whatever they were watching. It was a Friday night, and neither of them had anywhere to be in the morning. Bonnie was just too tired to fight anymore. She had done enough fighting for one day. So, she just let it go. She told them not to stay up too late, and then she left them on the couch, went to her own bedroom at the end of the hall, and turned out the lights. A few hours later, something woke Bonnie up. She groggily rolled over and glanced at the glowing red numbers on her alarm clock. It was almost 3 a.m. She could still hear the TV on out in the living room. With a heavy sigh, Bonnie cracked open her bedroom door and yelled down the dark hallway for the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed, this time for real. As she settled back down under her covers, she heard the sound of the television finally clicking off. She heard footsteps padding down the hallway, and then the house was completely silent. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. But sometime later, in the deep pre-dawn darkness, she woke up again. She wasn't sure what had woken her. The house was still silent. She rolled over in her bed, and as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, they focused on something in the room with her. It was a large figure, a silhouette standing silently right beside her bed, looking down at her. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to a house that was eerily silent. On a normal Saturday morning, his mother would have already been up for hours, making breakfast, the smell of coffee filling the house, the sound of her moving around, getting a start on the weekend chores. But as Brandon walked out into the hallway, he didn't hear a thing. He went into the kitchen to see if she was there, but it was empty. There were no dirty pans in the sink, no fresh pot of coffee brewing. It looked like his mom hadn't even been awake yet, which was very strange for her. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace, just waking up herself, said she hadn't seen her. So together, Brandon and Candace walked down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Brandon called out for her, "Mom?" Still nothing. He hesitated for a moment, then he pushed the door open and looked inside. And the sight that met his eyes made him gasp in horror. The room was covered in blood. But the bedroom was empty. His mom wasn't there. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled his car up to the curb outside of a house in a quiet Tucson suburb. He was there to investigate what was being called an apparent kidnapping of a mother from her own home. Faust was feeling the strain of the job. 1995 had turned out to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders in the county that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was completely swamped. Faust was already juggling more cases than he could handle, and now he had another one. But at this point, all he knew was that a woman named Bonnie Sanborn was missing and that her kids had found blood in her bedroom. As far as anyone knew, this wasn't a murder yet. Faust was holding on to a sliver of hope that maybe this wasn't as bad as it sounded, that they would find Bonnie and that she would be okay. He got out of his car and saw that uniformed officers had already secured the scene with yellow crime scene tape. He saw a young boy and a teenage girl sitting on the front curb, their faces pale with shock and fear. Faust noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts. He correctly guessed that these must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had called 911. He made a mental note that he would need to speak with them as soon as he could. He ducked under the tape, walked through the front yard, and went into the house. A crime scene photographer met him just inside the front door and led him down the hallway toward the master bedroom. As they walked, Faust's eyes were drawn to a family photo hanging on the wall. It showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 children, all of them smiling, looking like the picture-perfect American family. Before they reached the bedroom, the photographer paused and turned to Faust. He warned the detective that it was bad in there, that there was a lot of blood. Faust just nodded grimly. The photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately understood the warning. The room was a nightmare. Blood was splattered across the walls, soaked into the carpet, smeared on the windows. The mattress on the bed was drenched in it. Faust felt his heart sink. He was a seasoned homicide detective, but this was one of the worst scenes he'd ever walked into. With this amount of blood loss, the chances of finding their victim alive were practically zero. But he knew they couldn't figure out what happened to her or who was responsible until they found her body. Faust carefully stepped into the room, moving closer to the bed where a forensic technician was already dusting for fingerprints. The mattress was so saturated with blood it was almost black in some places. On one of the pillows, he could clearly see the perfect bloody imprint of a hand. He figured it had to belong to either Bonnie or her attacker. They would have to wait for the lab results to know for sure. Faust stepped back to get a wider view of the room. He noticed that the bed sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were bunched up in a ball in the middle of the blood-soaked mattress. To him, the scene screamed of a long, violent struggle. It looked like the attack had started while Bonnie was in bed, and that most of the violence had happened right there. He also saw a folding knife with a bright red handle lying on the mattress. Nearby, a purse had been emptied out. Multiple credit cards and a checkbook were scattered across the bed. The fact that these valuable items were left behind made Faust think that robbery probably wasn't the motive for whatever had happened to Bonnie. Then, something small on the floor by the bed caught his eye. After checking with the photographer to make sure the area had already been documented, Faust put on a pair of latex gloves, crouched down, and carefully picked it up. It was a small, brown button. He took it over to the closet and started going through the clothes hanging inside, but the button didn't seem to match anything that belonged to Bonnie. Based on where he found it, Faust theorized that the button must have been torn off someone's clothing during the struggle. It could have come from the clothes Bonnie was wearing, or it could have come from her attacker. Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it as evidence. He continued to scan the room. Amidst all the chaotic blood spatter, he noticed a distinct trail of red droplets snaking across the carpet. The trail led directly to a sliding glass door that opened into the backyard. He went over and tried the handle. It was unlocked. The forensics officer working in the room confirmed that no one from their team had touched that door all morning. It must have been left unlocked by the killer. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard. He followed the trail of blood droplets across the grass, all the way to a side door that led into the garage. He noted that there were no drag marks in the grass. This suggested that Bonnie's attacker hadn't dragged her out of the house. They had carried her. This implied the attacker was likely bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But then, looking at the family photos again, Faust could see that Bonnie was a very petite woman. That didn't really narrow down the list of suspects very much. Many people could have been strong enough to carry her. Faust reached the door to the garage and turned the knob. It was also unlocked. He pushed it open and looked inside. The garage was empty, there was no car, but the trail of blood clearly continued a few feet inside before it stopped. The picture was becoming clearer in Faust's mind. The suspect had carried Bonnie from her bedroom through the backyard and into this garage. They had then loaded her into the car that was normally parked here, and they had driven away with her. Faust knew that his best chance of finding Bonnie now was to identify the missing car and put out an alert for it. Once he had finished his initial survey of the crime scene, Faust went back outside. He found Bonnie's two younger children, Candace and Brandon, still sitting on the curb. He crouched down next to them. They were both still visibly shaken, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. Faust, in a very gentle voice, asked them to tell him about the last time they had seen their mother. Candace spoke up first. She said the last time she actually saw her was around 11:45 the night before, when their mom had said goodnight and gone to bed. But, she added, around 3:00 the morning, she and Brandon were still up watching TV when their mom had yelled from her bedroom for them to turn it off and go to sleep. She said that after their mom yelled, they got up, turned off the TV, and went to their own rooms. Both kids insisted that they didn't hear or see anything else unusual until they woke up that morning and made the horrific discovery in their mother's bedroom. This timeline gave Faust something to work with. If the kids were telling the truth, then Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m. It also suggested something else about the killer. If the suspect was able to get in through the sliding glass door in Bonnie's bedroom, attack her, find her car keys, and then carry her out to the garage and drive away, all without waking anyone else in the house, it strongly suggested that this person was familiar with the layout of the house. They had probably been there before. This might be someone the family knew. Faust then pointed to the bloodstains on Candace and Brandon's shirts and asked them how they got there. Candace admitted that before they called 911, she and her brother had gone into the bedroom and desperately searched for their mom, hoping she was just hurt and hiding somewhere. In their frantic search, they had gotten blood on their clothes. Faust understood. They were just kids, terrified and looking for their mother. But he also knew, with a sinking feeling, that this meant his primary crime scene was now contaminated. The kids had likely touched multiple surfaces, moved things around, and inadvertently destroyed or obscured potential evidence. But he didn't say any of this to them. He just calmly told them to go inside, change their clothes, and give the bloody clothes to one of the forensics technicians. He also instructed them to stay far away from their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded, stood up, and took her little brother by the hand. As they walked back toward the house, another sheriff's deputy approached Faust. The deputy told him there was someone else he needed to talk to. Bonnie had another child, a 15-year-old son named Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust walked down the sterile hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, a file folder tucked under his arm. He opened the door to a small, windowless office. A teenage boy was already sitting inside, waiting for him. Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the file. It was Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest son. Faust walked in and sat down across from him. As gently as he could, he broke the news to Bradley that his mother was missing. He explained that based on the evidence they found in her bedroom, it appeared she had been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and that there was a very real possibility she was no longer alive. Faust knew that Bradley couldn't have physically been the one to attack his mother. He had a rock-solid alibi, being locked up in this very facility at the time of the attack. But Faust had been doing some digging into Bradley's friends. He opened the file folder he was carrying and spread the papers out on the desk in front of Bradley. He began showing Bradley the information he had gathered on his friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several police informants, he was known for always carrying a knife. There were even stories that he would sometimes pull the knife out and bizarrely stab himself in the side of the head. Faust wondered aloud if the red-handled folding knife they'd found on Bonnie's mattress belonged to Jason. He suggested that maybe the attack on Bonnie was an act of revenge for her calling the police on Jason and Bradley just the day before. But as Faust watched Bradley for a reaction, he saw that the boy's tough exterior had completely crumbled. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he choked out that he didn't know anything. He admitted that he and his mom argued a lot, but he swore he would never, ever hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's grief seemed completely genuine. He immediately concluded that if Jason's gang was involved in his mother's disappearance, Bradley was not in on the plan. Asking Bradley more questions seemed like a dead end. Faust decided his next step was to find Jason and talk to him directly. Later that same night, Faust was back at the station, a cold cup of coffee on his desk, sifting through police records on Bradley, Jason, and Jason's gang. After leaving the juvenile center, Faust had immediately sent officers out to find and interview Jason, but it was proving to be much more difficult than he had anticipated. He knew Jason wasn't in custody, but he also wasn't at any of his previously known addresses. He had basically vanished. So Faust had officers fanning out across the city, talking to as many of Jason's known associates and fellow gang members as they could find, hoping someone knew where he was or knew something about Bonnie's disappearance. So far, they had come up empty on both fronts. Just then, the door to Faust's office opened. A deputy poked his head in and told him there was someone in the lobby he should probably talk to. Faust got up, walked out to the front lobby, and was surprised to see Jason Horbachevsky sitting there, waiting for him. When Jason saw Faust, he stood up, a cocky, confident smirk on his face. He told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to show them he had nothing to hide. Faust didn't even bother asking him where he had been. He just led him straight back to an interrogation room. As they sat down at the table across from each other, Faust's eyes were immediately drawn to the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the one he had found on the floor of Bonnie's bedroom. And as he looked closer, he saw that a few of the buttons on the shirt were missing. Faust felt a jolt of excitement, but he kept his expression neutral. He decided not to ask about the button just yet. He didn't want to show his hand too early. Instead, he started the interview with standard questions, asking Jason about his friendship with Bradley, his relationship with Bonnie, and his whereabouts on the night of the attack. Jason admitted that he was angry at Bonnie for calling the cops on them, but he denied having any plan for revenge. He insisted he had no idea where Bonnie was or what had happened to her. He claimed he had been at home, asleep, on the night she was attacked. At the end of the interview, he readily agreed to give Faust a DNA sample. He even took off his shirt with the missing brown buttons and turned it over for forensic analysis. After that, Faust let Jason go. He had a strong feeling he had his man, but he would have to wait for the lab to confirm it. The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, Faust was back in his office, organizing the mountain of information his team had collected over the past 24 hours. While he had been dealing with Bradley and Jason, other detectives had been re-interviewing Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, no one had any useful information. A few neighbors had confirmed that the Sanborns were a troubled family, but beyond that, they all said Bonnie was a nice person, and they couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. Faust was reading through the interview transcripts, searching for any small clue he might have missed when his office phone rang. He picked it up. The man on the other end of the line sounded panicked. He said he had a tip about the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning he had seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance. The report had mentioned that police were looking for her car, a light blue Chrysler. The man said that just the day before, he and his wife had been out for a run and had passed a car exactly like that. It was abandoned on the side of a dirt road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time they hadn't gotten too close to it and hadn't really thought anything of it. But after seeing the news report, he and his wife had driven back out to the desert to see if the car was still there. He said not only was it still there, but when they got up close and looked in the window, they could see what looked like a woman's body in the back seat. Faust immediately wrote down the location. When he checked it on a map, he realized the spot was only about a half a mile from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man for calling, hung up the phone, and raced out to his car. He drove out past the edge of town into the open desert, and sure enough, up ahead, he saw a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He pulled his own car over, got out, and cautiously approached the Chrysler. He peered through the back window, and his heart sank. He saw a woman's body slumped over in the back seat. It was Bonnie. He had been holding out hope, but seeing her there, dead in such a brutal and undignified way, was just heartbreaking. Faust walked back to his car and radioed for the forensics team. Once they arrived and began processing the new scene, he went back over to the Chrysler to examine the body more closely. He put on a fresh pair of gloves and leaned into the car. He gently lifted Bonnie's head and saw that there were multiple severe wounds all over her skull, as if she had been repeatedly struck with a sharp, heavy object. Her partial nudity also made it clear that a sexual assault had likely occurred. There were also numerous defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, clear evidence that she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a blacklight and began scanning the back seat of the car for biological evidence. As he ran the light over Bonnie's leg, a spot on her skin lit up brightly. The officer told Faust that it was almost certainly the killer's semen. He carefully took a swab of the area, placed it in an evidence bag, and told Faust that within a few weeks, they should have a full DNA profile of their killer. In the meantime, the fingerprints that had been lifted from Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and the results came back with a match that surprised everyone, especially Detective Faust. All of the prints, including the bloody handprint on the pillow, belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. As much as Faust didn't want to believe that a young girl could be involved in a plot to murder her own mother, he now had to seriously consider it. Not just because of the prints, but because of the well-documented history of problems within the Sanborn family. He knew Candace couldn't have committed this crime on her own, but it was possible she had helped whoever did. Faust brought Candace in for questioning again. When he confronted her with the fingerprint evidence, she completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She insisted again that she had just been scared and confused, that she had gone into the room looking for her mom and hadn't realized she was touching everything and leaving her prints all over the place. Looking at the terrified teenager, Faust's gut told him she wasn't involved. She just seemed like a scared kid who had stumbled into a nightmare. But he was still convinced that Bonnie's killer had to be someone who knew her personally, someone who had been in her house before. And that left one major person of interest who had not yet been ruled out, Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to terrible hold music. On his desk was a handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers. Bonnie's husband, Robert, was supposed to have been in Maryland on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he said he was there didn't mean it was true. Faust knew there were multiple flights that Robert could have secretly taken from Maryland back to Tucson, giving him a window of opportunity to commit the murder and then fly back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every possible flight Robert could have taken, and he was now painstakingly calling each airline one by one to check the passenger manifests. So far, he had struck out. Robert Sanborn's name hadn't appeared on any of the flights he had checked. He was now on hold with the very last airline on his list. Just then, the music cut out and an airline representative came on the line. She told Faust that she had triple-checked her records and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either. He thanked her and hung up the phone with a sigh. He knew this didn't completely clear Robert. This was before 9/11, and air travel security was much more lax back then. It was possible for someone to fly on a domestic flight without even showing an ID. Robert could have easily traveled under a fake name. But there was one more step he could take. He would ask Robert for a DNA sample. When the lab results came back for the sample found on Bonnie's body, he would have a definitive answer. One morning in early January of 1996, about a month after Bonnie's murder, Faust's office phone rang. It was a technician from the crime lab on the other end. In the weeks since Bonnie's body was found, 5 more murders had occurred in the Tucson area, and Faust and his team were stretched to their breaking point. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it took Faust a moment to remember which case he was talking about. But once he did, he sat up straight at his desk and grabbed a pen. He held his breath as the lab tech delivered the news. The DNA from the sample found on Bonnie's leg was not a match for her husband Robert. Nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. The lab also confirmed that the brown buttons from Jason's shirt were not a match for the button found in Bonnie's bedroom. It was just a bizarre coincidence. Faust was deeply disappointed. He had really thought Jason was their guy. But he wasn't going to give up. He asked the lab tech to run the killer's DNA profile against the state's database of convicted sex offenders to see if they could get a match there. But as the weeks turned into months, the crime lab kept calling with the same update, no match. The investigation stalled. Faust was pulled off to work on other, more active cases. By the summer of 1996, it was looking like Bonnie Sanborn's murder was going to go cold. And then, after 9 long months with no progress, an anonymous tip came in. That September, Detective Faust sat in an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across a small table from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had claimed that Lyle sold drugs in Bonnie's neighborhood and that he had been saying some very suspicious things about the case. When Faust had looked into Lyle's background, he found that he had a history of violent crimes, many of them involving knives. Now, sitting in the interrogation room, Lyle was visibly nervous, constantly shifting in his chair, his eyes darting around the room. When Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle began making strange excuses for the killer. He said that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy, that maybe he was just, in Lyle's words, on a bad trip. Faust found his behavior incredibly suspicious. He asked Lyle for a DNA sample, and Lyle agreed. Faust sent the sample off to the crime lab and then had to endure another several weeks of waiting for the results. When they finally came in, it was another dead end. Lyle Winstead was not a match. At this point, Faust was beyond frustrated. They had put so much time and effort into this case with absolutely nothing to show for it. He didn't want to see Bonnie's file get put back on the shelf to gather dust. He decided to go back to the very beginning to re-examine every single piece of evidence, every interview, to make sure he hadn't missed something. The next month, in between working his other cases, Faust found the time to go door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview every single person his team had already spoken to almost a year earlier. He knew how gossip and rumors could spread in a tight-knit community like this one. Even though no one had been able to offer any solid leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe some new information might have surfaced in the months since the murder. So he knocked on one door after another, patiently asking the same questions over and over again. And eventually, at a house just down the street from Bonnie's, a woman told him something. She said she didn't know anything herself, but there was a rumor circulating in the neighborhood that he might want to look into. Faust listened intently. And after so many frustrating false starts and dead ends, it was this small neighborhood rumor that would finally allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and the DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, This is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on the night of the 9th of December 1995. Around 2:30 inches the morning, her killer was watching her house from a hiding spot across the street. The killer knew the Sanborns were planning to move to Maryland, and he felt a strange sense of urgency, like there was something he had to do before they left. Around 3 a.m., the killer saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. A few moments later, he saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that light went out too, plunging the entire house into darkness. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep before he went inside. Confident that the coast was clear, the killer grabbed his tools, a set of flex ties and a chipping hammer. A chipping hammer is a specific type of tool used by welders, with a normal hammer face on one side and a sharp, pointed pick on the other. Carrying this brutal weapon, he crept across the street, through Bonnie's backyard, and right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. He knew from past experience that the family often left it unlocked. He was right. The door slid open without a sound. He knew that this door led directly into Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding the door open, the killer stepped inside. He saw Bonnie in her bed, asleep under the covers, began to move toward her, but as he stepped closer, a floorboard creaked loudly under his weight. Bonnie stirred in her sleep. She rolled over and looked in the direction of the sound. Her eyes met the killer's in the darkness. He knew he had lost the element of surprise. He had to act. No. He lunged at the bed. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The kill element was too strong and completely overpowered her, striking her repeatedly with the hammer. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but while she was still alive, the killer used the flex ties to bind her hands tightly behind her back. Then, as she lay helpless and bleeding on the bed, he frantically searched the room for her purse. When he found it, he dumped its contents out onto the bed until he found what he was looking for, her car keys. He grabbed the keys, and then he picked up Bonnie's still-living body, carried her back out through the sliding glass door, across the backyard, and into the garage. There, he used her keys to unlock her blue Chrysler. He put Bonnie in the back seat, then he got into the driver's seat and drove out into the desert, parking on the side of a quiet, deserted road. When the killer was finished with Bonnie, he simply got out of the car, left her there, and began the short walk back into town. As the sun began to rise, the killer casually walked right back down Bonnie's street, back to his own house, just a few doors down. It turned out that Detective Faust had been so focused on suspects within Bonnie's immediate circle of family and friends that he had overlooked the person who was, quite literally, the closest to her. Her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Freddie and his father had done some repair work at Bonnie's house in the past, so he was familiar with the layout. The rumor that the neighbor had told Faust was that Freddie had a crush on Bonnie, that he found her attractive. Another rumor was also circulating about a woman in the neighborhood being assaulted by a younger man, and some people suspected it was Freddie. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all Faust had. So police made the decision to collect DNA samples from every young man living on that block. And when the results came back, Freddie Royval's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Bonnie's body. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after he murdered Bonnie Sanborn. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But for the people who lived on that quiet Tucson street, the most disturbing part of the case was never just the brutality of the murder itself. It was the realization that Bonnie's killer had been there the entire time. Watching from across the street, walking past her house, blending into the neighborhood like nothing was wrong. And while Bonnie spent her final months worrying about the dangers inside her own home, the real threat had been waiting just outside of it all along. As dawn broke on the 5th of February, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlone stood in her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment kitchen. The small apartment smelled like coffee, even though the sun wasn't up. Morning stillness was Laverne's favorite time. The only time she had the flat to herself and could breathe was then. She resided there with boyfriend John Sosnovsky. John always left before morning to take his bus to work at a local mill where his shift started early. Laverne was relieved every time the front door closed behind him, like a weight had been removed. Since John wasn't home, Laverne could pretend her life was normal. She might act safe. She was merely acting for herself. Indeed, John was violent. He was severely physically abusive, especially when drunk, which was almost constantly. His fury was a regular storm in their home that Laverne had to navigate. Her first husband died of cancer. After his death, she met John when she was lonely and weak. She didn't realize John's true nature until she was already ensnared in his web. 10 long years. 10 years of treading on eggshells, hiding bruises, and dreading his key in the door. Laverne still lacked the guts to quit. She was afraid of what he would do if she attempted. He made it plain what would happen. Thus, she felt absolutely trapped at home. She made coffee and sat at her modest kitchen table that morning. As usual, she unwrapped the local paper. Her first sight was a large black and white photo of a young woman on the front page. The woman smiled, looking vibrant in her 20 seconds. The snapshot accompanied a murder story. About 30 miles northeast of Portland, it happened. Tanya Bennett was the victim. The smiling girl was Tanya Bennett. The article said she was viciously battered and strangled with a rope. Highway side, her body was left. Laverne got a chill reading about Tanya's discovery. That article indicated her body was dumped near a prominent scenic viewpoint. This place was familiar to Laverne. She'd been there before. About 1.5 miles from the lookout. Her mental image of the region was excellent. Laverne sat there, her coffee cold, her eyes flitting between the words on the page and Tanya's beaming face. As she watched, a thought formed. She felt strangely familiar with this horrific deed. She initially couldn't place it. She continued staring at Tanya's eyes in the photo. Then her brain switched on. She was sure she knew who did this when everything fell apart. John, her boyfriend, had probably killed this woman. Laverne got up from the table, even though she loved her quiet mornings. Her hands shook. She contacted the cops from her kitchen's wall-mounted phone. Laverne felt like her heart would explode after hanging up the phone. She was shivering uncontrollably. She took a huge risk. She didn't know if the police could arrest John with the information she gave them. If not, John would likely learn she called if they questioned and released him. He discovered she betrayed him and told police she thought he was a killer. If that happened, his abuse would worsen. She had no idea what he would do to her. Her view was that there were only two outcomes. She could either sever her relationship with John and send him to prison for a long period, or she could wind up like Tanya Bennett, another dead girl on a highway. On the morning of February 16, Detective John Ingram sat on a couch in a spotless Wilsonville, Oregon living room. He and his partner were in Laverne's apartment. As the lead investigator on the Tanya Bennett murder case, Ingram spoke with Laverne, who was sitting on the couch opposite him. She appeared anxious. She couldn't sit still, fidgeted, and gave him and his buddy coffee and water 3 times. Something was clearly on her mind. Ingram knew this woman had tipped a week before. Susan told the dispatcher she thought her boyfriend, John Sosnowski, killed Tanya. Now, Ingram was here to hear the whole story. He wanted every detail she could give because his case was hopeless. This Laverne tip was their only lead. Tanya's body was located on a grassy slope near the highway, where vehicles could see her. Yet, Ingram and his crew found no eyewitnesses. Several people claimed to have seen Tanya at a bar the night she disappeared. Nobody could describe the man she was with. Just a man. Ingram and his companion followed the rules. They contacted everyone who knew Tanya. They canvassed her neighborhood door to door. They interviewed her family, co-workers, and acquaintances. Despite that, they had no suspects. The crime scene provided scant evidence, making matters worse. They had no useful fingerprints, physical evidence, or forensics to identify a killer. In this clean apartment, Ingram was betting everything on Laverne. He hoped she would give him the case-opening key. He tried to smile at her to reassure her. "When you're ready, tell me what you know. Explain why you think John killed Tanya." Laverne initially squirmed in her seat. It was obvious she was nervous. Ingram advised her to breathe deeply and relax. He told her that was okay, they wanted her narrative. "Finally," she said with a trembling voice. She informed them John had come home late the night of the murder, possibly around 1 or 2 in the morning. He immediately entered the bathroom and showered. She said this was unusual. John didn't take 2 morning showers. It wasn't his habit. Laverne didn't think much of it at the moment. My understanding came the next day. They were at a local tavern when she overheard John. She heard John brag about murdering Tanya Bennett at the pub. He detailed how he picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then drove her body to the highway by the Columbia River Gorge to dump her near that gorgeous viewpoint. Ingram and his companion looked at Laverne as he told the story. It surprised them. Laverne effectively overheard a confession. Her details matched what the cops knew. Tanya was observed late at night with an unknown male. Yes, her body was recovered near that gorgeous overlook. Although the body's location had been reported, hearing it as part of this confession was powerful. Perfect poker face, Ingram kept his face neutral. He nodded and calmly advised Laverne to keep on and tell him everything. So Laverne continued. She said she was afraid to speak up. John frightened her. She called him a violent alcoholic who abused her often. She stated this helped her believe his confession. That John could kill someone didn't surprise her. Violence was a daily threat to her. She was terrified he would murder her if she told anyone. So she hid this dreadful secret for days. But then she saw the newspaper article. Tanya seemed young and innocent in the photo. Laverne said she felt she owed the girl to speak up, no matter the risk. Ingram's mind was racing. If Laverne was right, this was a major case break. This may solve everything. This may have been Tanya Bennett's complete narrative. However, as an experienced detective, he understood he only had one woman's story. Even though she was convincing, he couldn't trust her. He needed tangible proof. So he requested Laverne to let him search the apartment. When Laverne nodded, the 2 investigators got up and started work. The detectives followed Laverne down a small hallway to the master bedroom. Once there, she stood by the doorway and let the men work. The detectives divided instantly. Ingram's colleagues started on one side of the room and Ingram on the other to maximize efficiency. Ingram presented a list of items they wanted to locate that could link a suspect to the crime site. A little denim swatch was crucial. It was Tanya's pants' front buttoned part. This portion was missing when they found her body. Interestingly, it was cut out cleanly. It made Ingram suspect the killer took a trophy or keepsake. Ingram didn't find the denim patch after several minutes of digging through the bedroom. At first sight, he saw no connection between John and Tanya. A cardboard box with old documents sat in the corner, so he went there. The random letters and receipts were sorted by him. He found it then. He took out a damaged scrap of paper. A handwritten message was there. "Good piece, T. Bennett." Ingram froze. He instantly summoned his partner. His partner looked down at Ingram's note as they crossed the room. Both realized the significance. T. Bennett must be Tanya Bennett. This was huge. They glanced at each other and thought the same. John needed to be talked to immediately. The door opened as they exited the bedroom and walked to the front door to leave the flat. The gateway was manned by John Sosnowski. Detective Ingram was at the sheriff's interrogation table an hour later. John sat across. Although he was confused, John appeared calm for a man who had just found 2 detectives in his bedroom. Ingram introduced himself and explained why they were at the flat when John entered. John seemed astonished, but didn't argue. He readily consented to answer questions at the station. However, Ingram was an experienced detective. He realized that cooperation didn't prove innocence. Sometimes it implied the reverse. Ingram passed John a Tanya photo across the table. He asked if he knew her or was involved in her murder. John didn't rage, not denying it. He didn't seem alarmed by the inquiry. He said he didn't remember after looking at the picture. Ingram then showed him the T-written note they found in his bedroom. "Good piece, Bennett." John glanced at the page and wasn't sure if he wrote it. Simple, direct questions needed. Simple, direct responses. Ingram was suspicious that John couldn't answer them clearly. The interview continued as usual. No matter what Ingram asked, John would just give these vague, non-committal answers. He struggled to answer yes or no questions. Ingram was struck by John's nonchalance during the interview. He pretended to talk about the weather while being questioned about a terrible murder. This was no time for laziness. This was a time to be honest and defend yourself. Despite his gut sense and intense suspicion of John, Ingram realized his sole proof was circumstantial. A bizarre note and girlfriend tale. It was insufficient to arrest him for murder. They sought concrete proof linking John to Tanya. After the weird interview, Ingram groaned and told John he could leave. 4 days later, Ingram's desk phone rang when he arrived to work. He was astonished to hear Laverne's voice when he answered. Before he could ask why she was phoning, Laverne said she found something in her car that morning. She believed he needed to see it. And when she told him, Ingram instructed her to stay and he would be right over. He went to find his partner after hanging up the phone. His heart raced as he drove to Laverne's flat. The past several days were frustrating. No fresh evidence proved John was their killer. One piece of evidence was lost. The note in John's box of papers was useless. Their forensics lab couldn't identify John's handwriting, so they couldn't prove he wrote it. Based on what Laverne told him on the phone and what she found in her car, Ingram was almost certain this was the break he had been waiting for. Ingram and his partner met Laverne in her garage within an hour. All eyes were on her car's trunk. Laverne told Ingram she kept her car and life spotless. Her car and apartment were clean. Nothing was out of place. A little denim swatch was in her car trunk when she went out that day. She was certain she hadn't put anything there. With her suspicions of John and his link to the murder, she immediately thought she should report it to the police. As they gazed into that trunk, Ingram and his companion felt struck. The trunk's clean carpet held a little denim square with buttons. It matched the denim they were secretly seeking. A crime detail was kept from the public. Outside the investigation, no one knew the killer took Tanya's jeans portion. They found it in their primary suspect's girlfriend's car. This needed to be their break. That was Tanya's jeans denim. The call by Laverne was correct. This was huge. Naturally, Ingram understood they had to follow process. A lab test would be needed to determine that the denim swatch matched Tanya's jeans when she died. It could have been a coincidence from Laverne or John's jeans. But the conditions were too ideal. It felt like winning the lottery. Ingram watched his companion use tweezers to gently place the swatch in an evidence bag and seal it. They assured Laverne they would examine it immediately and contact her. Ingram reviewed their findings at his desk the next morning. They felt wealthy at this time. After locating the denim, they summoned John back for a polygraph test the night before. He failed totally. In his report, the test administrator stated that John knew what happened to Tanya. Ingram awaited one more piece of the puzzle. He awaited the lab's confirmation that the fabric matched. Once he got the call, they might arrest John. Then his phone rang. He grabbed it immediately. It was Lab. Ingram straightened his chair, anticipating good news. The other technician sounded down. He told Ingram that Laverne's automobile denim swatch didn't match Tanya's jeans. It wasn't hers. Ingram was stunned. He sat silently. The idea that they located the same unique denim cut in their prime suspect's residence by chance seemed absurd. Denim swatches from the front of jeans weren't common. It was too specific. There must be more to this story. Ingram attempted to figure out why the swatch was in her car, but nothing made sense. The only plausible reason was denim planting. As the thought hit, Ingram felt shocked and frustrated. He felt like he was starting over after thinking he was close to solving this case. He knew his next stop. He needed another Laverne conversation. Later that morning, Ingram and his colleague sat in Laverne's living room again. Laverne sat across from them, worried. But this time, Ingram would do things differently. He would punish her more. He knew her previous story was false. After sitting down, Ingram asked her directly. He stared her in the eye and asked if she planted that denim in her car. As soon as he said that, Laverne's face fell. After quivering her lower lip, she cried. She sobbed and apologized. She admitted to doing it. She chopped up an old pair of jeans and put the buttons in her automobile. She lied about finding it to get enough proof to arrest John. She was frightened when they let him leave after the first interview. She knew John killed Tanya. He had mentioned it to her. She wanted the cops to hold him accountable because he was dangerous. Ingram could tell she was sincere as she spoke. This woman was clearly afraid of John and feared he was a murderer. Even if planting evidence was wrong, he wanted to believe her motive. She had a major problem with her story. He knew Laverne was still concealing things. Because without inside knowledge of the crime site or other facts, she could not have planted that exact denim cut. Missing something. Why did she arbitrarily choose the front button fly of a pair of jeans to plant evidence? The pic seemed too detailed to be random. When he asked Laverne how she knew to cut that piece, her energy changed. The crying ceased. Sadness and regret vanished. It was replaced by hesitation. She seemed unsure how to react. It appeared she was caught. Then Laverne inhaled. She looked at Ingram and said, "I lied. You're right. My story about planting evidence was false." However, she claimed she lied out of fear. She worried the cops would arrest her if they learned the whole truth. Then Laverne detailed what she said happened to Tanya Bennett. Laverne alleged John called her the night Tanya was murdered. He sounded frantic. He informed her he was in trouble and to meet him at the bar. He instructed her to bring a shower curtain. Laverne said she didn't ask questions because John scared her. So she did as he said. She drove to the bar with a shower curtain from their bathroom. John was in the parking lot when she arrived. He stood over a corpse. It was Tanya. She lay unmoving on the cold pavement. Shocked, Laverne said. She had no idea what to do. She helped him. She helped John lift Tanya into her car trunk. The shower curtain she brought was wrapped around her. They drove to the highway and discarded her body at the picturesque overlook. Laverne's story darkened as she spoke. She later admitted that Tanya was alive when she arrived at the parking lot. She claimed Tanya was barely surviving. Laverne restrained Tanya's neck with a rope at John's request as he sexually attacked her. Laverne reported Tanya stopped breathing when he finished. Ingram was stunned as he listened. This gentle, soft-spoken elderly woman was suddenly telling him she actively engaged in the sexual assault and murder of a young woman. It was hard for him to comprehend. Ingram only thought, this can't be real. Laverne's claim fit. It clarified everything. It explained John's cagey interview answers, failed polygraph test, and, most crucially, how Laverne knew about the denim. She knew what area of Tanya's trousers to cut out and put as phony evidence because she and John had cut them originally. Despite this life-changing revelation, Ingram wanted to be sure this horrific, detailed account was true. And he knew how to prove it. The next day, Ingram drove his police cruiser. Laverne sat in the back, peering out the window, while his partner was in the passenger seat. They were driving northeast of Portland on the freeway. When they reached where she and John dropped Tanya's body, Ingram told Laverne to tell him. The newspapers had reported the body's broad location, but not its actual position. Ingram understood that if Laverne could pinpoint the place, she was telling the truth. Ingram's heart rate increased as they approached the spot. He maintained his speed. He didn't slow down or signal their approach. He kept driving straight, waiting for Laverne to speak. Laverne didn't say a thing as the cruiser drove by Tanya's body. They continued driving silently for a few minutes. Disappointed, Ingram was. This story seemed like another falsehood. Laverne suddenly spoke from the back seat. She said, "Hold on. Turn around." Ingram found a space to turn the car around, and they headed back. This time, Laverne yelled out as they passed the crime scene, the slope where Tanya was found. She claimed that was her location. "Stop." Ingram looked at Laverne as he pulled over to the shoulder. She stared out the window at the body's location. They exited the automobile together. Laverne crossed the road and pointed down the grassy slope to where Tanya had been found. Ingram was astonished. Laverne was honest. Her choice of location would have been difficult without having been there before. She must have participated. Ingram felt they had all they needed as they got back in the car. The evidence was sufficient to arrest John and Laverne. She had come forward, but now she would pay the price. Just 16 days after Laverne made her first anonymous contact, John Sosnowski was arrested on February 21. Laverne Pavlone was arrested 5 days later. Both were charged with murder. Laverne's trial began 11 months later. Laverne sought to amend her tale again. She sought to retract her statement, saying she hadn't done anything. The jury didn't believe her. She received a life sentence for murder. 2 months later, John received the same sentence, life in jail. The case should have ended there. But Detective Ingram couldn't stop thinking about it for 3 years. He kept thinking about Laverne, John, and Tanya Bennett. Though Laverne had done wrong, he felt weird pity for her. She was clearly controlled by John and afraid of him. But more than that, Ingram had this terrible, persistent sensation that they had messed something. Ingram was in his office one March 1994 afternoon when his desk phone rang. The prosecutor handled Tanya's case. The prosecutor said they received a bizarre Tanya murder letter. The prosecutor explained the letter's contents, making Ingram queasy. Ingram was correct to worry. The legal system botched this case. He felt loose and incorrect about Laverne. Their star witness was not a nice, older woman terrified of her abusive lover. She had not spoken the truth despite the implications. That was not her tale. She lied about practically everything to Detective Ingram and his partner. Laverne wanted to break up with John but was terrified. To get rid of him, she devised a complicated and deadly strategy. She framed him for murder. At initially, she excelled. She read every newspaper item she could find to memorize Tanya's murder's facts. She discovered the missing denim swatch by sneaking a look at Ingram's list of evidence during her first apartment interview. Some was dumb luck. She predicted where the body was located on the highway, but she was right. Her strategy failed because she accidentally implicated herself in framing John. She believed that the police would sympathize with her and perceive her as a victim of John's deception, resulting in his arrest. But that didn't work. She was convicted of murder and imprisoned with him. Laverne and John were serving life sentences for a crime they didn't commit when the true perpetrator, the man who murdered Tanya Bennett, wrote to the authorities admitting. That was the letter the prosecutor called Ingram about. Laverne and John were released in 1995 after the true killer was arrested. Laverne's falsehoods got them 4 years in prison. 71-year-old Patrice Miller stood in front of her refrigerator in her little home one morning in early November 2023. She lived in rural Downeyville, California. Since she was running low on a few products, she ordered from the local market. They delivered her groceries, which was great. Patrice needed food delivery at this point. She lived alone and found housework harder as she aged. She was also having health issues, making movement difficult. Even with a walking stick, she navigated the house. Patrice heard one of her two cats meowing outside the door while she was making her grocery list. This prompted her to feed them. Thus, she delayed her list. She headed out the door with her walking stick after closing the fridge and pouring cat chow into a bowl. Patrice brought her porch cat food bowl. She had other outdoor tasks, but her walking stick limited her to one. She returned inside to retrieve her kitchen compost bin after setting up her cat's feeding bowl. She returned to her garden. She finished these outdoor duties fast because she didn't like being outside anymore. She had lived in Downeyville for years, but it had become unsafe. Since she stayed to herself, she didn't realize how awful it was. She eventually heard from her neighbors that their properties were being invaded. Vandalism had increased, with yards messed up and residences broken into. After a few months, Patrice started experiencing it. After so many attempted break-ins at her house, she was convinced she had a stalker. She even installed metal bars on all her windows for security. Patrice disliked the outdoors because of that. She felt exposed and weak. She believed her stalker was following her and might attack her. She quickly dumped the compost in her garden, turned around, and ran inside, locked the door. Once inside her residence, she breathed a great sigh of relief. A few days later, on November 8, Cassie Coe, a 55-year-old cashier, was counting up a client at Patrice's usual market. She bagged their stuff while thinking about something else. Patrice was on her mind. After years of delivering Patrice's groceries, Cassie had become more than a client and delivery lady. Friends? They frequently called to catch up. Cassie noticed she hadn't heard from Patrice in days. This was odd because of their closeness, and since Cassie knew Patrice hadn't ordered in long. Cassie asked throughout the store, but no one had heard from Patrice. Cassie knew Patrice could be busy. Just about anyone else wouldn't worry about a missing order. Cassie was especially worried because she knew Patrice's stalker. She knew Patrice had phoned the police, but they weren't helpful. This tiny rural hamlet was inundated with these calls. Burglaries, harassment, vandalism. Nobody had reported actual violence yet. Thus, local officials were inundated with small complaints. Patrice's condition wasn't worse than anyone else's, but the sheriff's department weren't staffed to investigate them all. They only advised Patrice on house security, so she put window bars. Cassie knew Patrice was afraid of her stalker, whom she called Big Bastard. She worried about what he would do next. Cassie called Patrice again after her shift. Cassie phoned the police for a wellness check after failing to locate her. A Sierra County Sheriff's Department deputy parked in front of Patrice's house that evening after driving up the lengthy driveway. He knew something was wrong immediately. The house's front door was broken and hanging off its hinges. It seemed like a garden hose had been left on the porch stairs, pouring water everywhere. The deputy exited his cruiser and approached the residence. He turned off the water at the house's side spigot. Then, he climbed the porch's front stairs. He scanned the area for sounds as he moved. He had no notion if the house was still dangerous or what he was entering. He looked through a window before entering through the smashed front door to see what was going on. Blood was his first sight. Just inside the door, blood covered the floor. He unholstered his gun. The deputy entered the residence through the broken entryway with his revolver. He slowly walked across the living room, listening for movement or evidence of someone. But the house was quiet. No one was intruding, but Patrice was missing. The blood in front of the home was all he saw. The deputy went from living room to kitchen. After crossing the threshold, he paused. The room was completely disorganized. All cabinet doors were open. The floor was covered in food, packing, and broken glass jars. The kitchen's far-end window was destroyed, and Patrice's security bars were bent and twisted, dangling on their hinges. The deputy initially missed what was on the floor in the center of the kitchen due to the clutter and devastation. Once his brain digested the sight, he understood he was gazing at Patrice. What was left of her, she no longer appeared human. Her body was mangled. The deputy fled the residence and reported his horrible discovery. Patrice's property was filled with police, crime scene technicians, and forensic experts within an hour. Detectives spoke to Patrice's neighbors as they spread out. The authorities quickly profiled Patrice's killer because practically everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the identical break-ins and property damage. The killer was the same person pestering everyone else, they concluded. The police couldn't figure out why. Why did Patrice face such serious violence while everyone else simply experienced minor vandalism? Police were reconstructing Patrice's last day's movements while searching for her killer. At first, they were stuck. It appeared she had only done basic duties that day. They discovered two minor details that explained everything as they investigated those chores. Patrice has been making two bad blunders every day for 2 years. She fed her cats on the porch and dumped her compost in the garden. Big Bastard, her stalker, came to her home because of these two innocent activities. A black bear named Big Bastard. His favorite foods were cat food and kitchen garbage. He eventually considered Patrice food. The bear waited as Patrice fed her pets and emptied her compost for the last time in early November 2023. After waiting until Patrice was asleep, it broke into her house and brutally killed her. The deputy arrived at her home after days of the bear returning and eating Patrice's remains. Black bears rarely attack. Patrice was California's first black bear fatality. The disaster was caused by such absence of perceived risk. Because of this, officials didn't help Patrice or her neighbors with bear complaints. They wondered, what could go wrong? Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. On the evening of the 28th of December 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt was driving his truck down a highway heading into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The lights of the city were just beginning to glow against the darkening desert sky. Next to him, his 11-year-old daughter Sienna was fast asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. They had been on the road for nearly 12 hours, a long, quiet drive all the way from his mother's home in California. They had just spent Christmas there. But it hadn't really been a very happy holiday. A few weeks earlier, Don's sister Janice had passed away from breast cancer. And Janice was one of the last truly close family members Don had left. His father was gone, his other sister was gone too, and he wasn't even on speaking terms with his younger brother, Dennis. They'd had a huge argument the year before, and things had never been the same. So when Don got the news about Janice, he knew he had to be with his mom. He immediately called his ex-wife and arranged to take Sienna with him for the trip. He really wished they could have stayed in California a little longer, but he had to get back to work. Don worked at an agency that provided services for people who were developmentally disabled, and there was a big, important meeting coming up that he just could not miss. His job was important to him. It was a way of giving back, of doing good in the world, something he had come to value more and more over the years. Just then, the brake lights of the car in front of him flashed bright red. Don slammed on his own brakes, bringing the truck to a sudden stop. Traffic was piling up, everything grinding to a halt for no apparent reason. He felt that old, familiar surge of anger rise up in his chest. It was a hot, prickly feeling he knew all too well. He laid on the horn, a long, frustrated blast. He was just about to roll down the window to yell something at the driver in front of him, but then he glanced over at Sienna. She had opened her eyes, startled by the sudden stop and the noise. Seeing the alarm on her face was enough to make him stop. He took a deep breath. He reminded himself that it was just traffic. It wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have a pretty bad temper when he was behind the wheel, a real case of road rage. But in recent years, he'd been working really hard to control it. He wanted to set a better example for his daughter. So he just sat there, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the traffic to move. Finally, the cars ahead started to inch forward. As he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through the familiar streets of downtown Albuquerque, Don made a conscious effort to shift his focus to something positive. He thought about the upcoming weekend. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And the thought of Spaghetti Sunday always made Don smile. It was a tradition he and Sienna had started together a few years back. Every Sunday, right after church, they would go home and cook up huge batches of spaghetti and meatballs. Then they'd pack it all up and take it downtown to feed the homeless community. At first, it had just been the two of them, a father and daughter with a big pot of pasta. But, over time, word had spread. More people had started to join in, bringing their own food or dropping off donations of clothes and canned goods. Before long, it had grown into a real community event, with whole groups of volunteers showing up every week. Don was so proud of what he'd created, but he was especially proud that he had done it with Sienna, teaching her the importance of kindness and compassion. Finally, Don turned down his own quiet residential street. He pulled into the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse. It was still decorated with Christmas lights, their cheerful colors a little out of place with the sadness he was feeling. He turned off the engine, and the garage fell silent. He got out of the car, woke Sienna up gently, and then grabbed their suitcases from the back. They walked to the front door, and he fumbled for his keys in his pocket. He unlocked the door, and as his daughter stepped inside, she let out a huge shriek of pure excitement. Don smiled. Waiting for her right there under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle, a shiny bow tied to the handlebars. She spun around, her eyes wide, and asked if she could please take it for a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes. He loved seeing her so happy. But it was already dark outside, and this was only supposed to be a quick stop. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 o'clock. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday week, and he was supposed to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a civil relationship for the most part, but he knew she'd be annoyed if he was late or if he tried to ask for more time. They had a schedule, and it was important to stick to it. So, Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait. He promised they could ride it all weekend. For now, he just needed her to go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would head out. As Sienna ran upstairs, Don noticed something strange. His golden retriever, Buddy, hadn't come to greet him. Normally, the dog would be all over him, tail wagging, jumping up the second he heard the key in the door. It was unusual. So, Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name. He finally found the dog cowering in the master bedroom, tucked away in a corner. Don extended his hand, and Buddy came forward, but he was skittish, sniffing his hand cautiously. This was really unnerving for Don. Buddy never acted scared of him. But then again, Don had been gone for a while. He told himself it was probably just separation anxiety. The dog missed him. So, he gave Buddy a gentle pat on the head, made sure his bowl was full of kibble, and then grabbed his keys again. It was time for the short drive over to Christine's house. Don drove very slowly through the neighborhood, trying to savor every last minute with Sienna. He treasured this time with his daughter more than anything. The mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost cost him the chance to be her father. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life. He went to church every Sunday, he ran his charity, he was a pillar of the community. But it hadn't always been that way. He had partied a lot in his youth. When Sienna was just a toddler, he'd had his dream job as a firefighter, but he'd lost it after failing a drug test. After he lost that job, the financial strain on his marriage to Christine became too much. She had to shoulder most of the bills, and the resentment built up. After a few months, Christine filed for divorce. It was a crushing blow for Don. But what was even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don already had 2 older kids from a previous marriage. After that divorce, his first wife had been given sole custody, and she had moved them all to Oklahoma. As a result, Don had barely seen them while they were growing up. It was one of the biggest regrets of his life. He was absolutely determined not to let that happen again with Sienna. So, he'd gone to court. He fought Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten ugly at times, really contentious, but in the end, it was worth it. Don made the most of every single moment he got to spend with his daughter. He was the dad who would braid her hair before school. He was the dad who would stay up late making elaborate costumes for her school plays. And on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he never, ever forgot to call her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway. Christine was already outside, standing by the front door with her arms crossed. As he got out of the car, she pointedly motioned to her watch. She was clearly annoyed that he was late. Don walked over and sort of apologized, explaining that it had been a really long drive from California. He told her they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and then they'd hit all that traffic coming into the city. Christine just sighed and said it was okay. She asked how the trip was, and Don told her it went as well as it could. They'd had a nice Christmas despite the sadness hanging over everything because of his sister's death. He said it had been meaningful just for the family to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and a kiss. He told her he loved her and promised to call her before bed, just like always. And he reminded her that when he saw her again that weekend, they would have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his own garage just 10 minutes later, he noticed that the big plastic trash can at the end of his driveway was lying on its side, overturned. He figured the wind must have knocked it over. So he parked his truck, got out, and walked down to the curb to flip it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed the button on the wall to close the garage door, and unlocked the interior door that led into his townhouse. As he was inside, taking off his shoes and his jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing. He thought he heard it start to roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the safety sensor at the bottom. He paused, listening intently. And then what he heard was the sound of the door closing again, this time hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. He shook his head. He must have been imagining things. He was tired from the long drive. His mind was playing tricks on him. Don dragged his suitcase into his bedroom and started to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and try not to think about anything for a while. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he looked up and saw a small, ugly hole in the ceiling. He let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months. He had really been hoping it would finally be done by the time he got home. He made a mental note to give the landlord yet another angry call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on. He headed out to the garage to have a cigarette before bed. It was his routine, a quiet moment to himself at the end of a long day. The following morning, on December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk with a cup of coffee when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up. It was Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna sounded worried. She told Valerie that her dad hadn't called her last night to say goodnight. She asked if he was there at the office now. Valerie stood up and peered over the cubicle wall at Don's desk. It was empty. His computer was off. This was a little unusual. Don was a very punctual guy. He was always one of the first people in the office. But it was still early. So she told Sienna not to worry. She said she would give Don a call right now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back as soon as he got the message. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. That was also strange. So she sent him a text message, just asking if everything was okay. She waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. He hadn't shown up at the office either. And now, Valerie was starting to feel a real sense of concern. It was not like Don to just skip work without calling in. And it was definitely not like him to ignore calls and texts, especially if he knew his daughter was trying to reach him. Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they both agreed that something felt wrong. They decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. Maybe he had just overslept, or maybe his phone had died. They hoped it was something simple. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy as Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked, but to her surprise, the door just swung open under the pressure of her hand. It hadn't been latched properly. She looked over at her coworker, a nervous expression on her face. Then the two of them cautiously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Dawn's name, but there was no answer. The house was quiet. So she started to wander through the living room, peeking into the bedroom on the first floor. The house seemed empty. Her coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Dawn on the second floor. Valerie decided she would check the garage to see if maybe Dawn's truck was there. If the truck was gone, maybe he just had an early morning appointment he forgot to mention. Valerie opened the door that led from the kitchen into the two-car garage. She flipped on the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered on, and she saw Dawn's truck parked in its usual spot. But as her eyes scanned the garage, something else caught her attention. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV that also parked in the shared space, she noticed a streak of something dark red. It ran down the wall. At this point, Valerie's heart started to pound in her chest. She was feeling pretty nervous, but she knew she had to see what it was. She began walking slowly toward that back wall, her eyes fixed on the dark streak. She was wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her, if it was just paint or rust. As she got closer and closer, the streak came into sharper focus. Finally, she was close enough that she could actually look down into the narrow space between the back of the SUV and that red-streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, an Albuquerque police detective named Matthew Kaplan pulled his unmarked car up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse. The whole property was already secured with yellow crime scene tape, and police officers were swarming the area. Two women in business clothes were sitting on the curb, their faces stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew so far was that a man had been found dead in the garage attached to this townhouse. And now, he was the lead investigator on the case. So, he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door. A uniformed officer standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more of the details. The victim had been identified as Dawn Fluitt. The two women sitting outside were his coworkers. They had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. The officer also told him there were no signs of forced entry. The women had said the front door was unlocked, just slightly ajar when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse, into the living room. The first thing he saw was a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. It looked like it hadn't even been ridden yet. Then he did a slow, methodical loop through the first and second floors. He noted there was a cell phone lying on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter full of cash and credit cards. It didn't look like anything had been rifled through. None of the drawers in the house were hanging open. The place was generally neat and orderly. On first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan to be a robbery gone wrong. Back on the first floor, Kaplan pushed open the door to the garage. Crime scene techs were already busy inside, their cameras flashing as they photographed the scene and collected forensic samples. Kaplan carefully stepped around them and knelt down next to Dawn's body. It was lying face up, wedged in the small space between an SUV and the back wall. Dawn's throat had been cut. It was a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other. There were also smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, on his ear, and on his hands, defensive wounds, as if he had tried to fight back against his attacker. There were also clear signs of blunt force trauma to his head, as if he had been hit repeatedly with a heavy object, something like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked very closely at Dawn's eyes, he saw tiny red dots, burst capillaries on his eyeballs and eyelids. He knew from experience that these were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent, almost overkill. It was gruesome. And Kaplan knew that kind of rage usually meant the murder was personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the rest of the scene. There was blood spattered on the walls and on a small refrigerator that stood next to the body. There were also bloody handprints smeared on the side of Dawn's own truck. But there was no large pool of blood on the concrete floor around Don's body. In fact, the floor looked strangely clean. It looked like somebody had recently mopped it, like they had tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty plastic bottle of bleach sitting on top of the washing machine nearby. His eyes narrowed. He walked over, he opened up the lid of the washer, and sure enough, he found a pile of wet towels inside. They still smelled strongly of bleach. The killer had stayed. They had taken the time to try and clean the scene. Just then, a crime scene tech came over, carrying a bottle of luminol spray. Luminol is a chemical that law enforcement uses to detect trace amounts of blood even after it's been cleaned up. It reacts with the iron in hemoglobin and glows a faint blue in the dark. Kaplan stepped back so the tech could spray the area. He followed him as he made his way through the garage and then back into the house. The luminol spray did indeed pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and inside the kitchen sink. Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage, and then they had come inside to wash their hands, or maybe even the murder weapon, in the kitchen sink before they left. But it's much harder to completely scrub a murder scene than most people realize. And so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually be able to recover some of the killer's DNA from the scene. Kaplan stepped out through the front door just as another car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car, looking agitated. He pushed right past the yellow crime scene tape, and Kaplan immediately put his hands up to stop him. The man looked totally flustered. He introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord. He asked what on earth the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Don Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped. Then he started talking a mile a minute. He said Don was a devoted father, a deeply religious man who would open up his home to anyone. He said that nobody would ever want to kill Don. But then Benny paused. He made a face, like a thought was just occurring to him. And he said that, actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Don did a lot of charity work with the city's homeless population. And he said it was possible that maybe somebody from the street could have followed Don home, broken into his house, and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny and sent him on his way, he just stood on Don's driveway, thinking about what the landlord had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder and the fact that nothing of value appeared to have been stolen, he doubted very much that this was just a random break-in by a homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Don's killer was someone Don knew. Maybe even someone who had a key to the house, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Don was a big, muscular guy, and it was clear from the defensive wounds that he had fought back hard against his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially large male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Don Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two coworkers had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan drove to the house of Don's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had already spoken to Christine on the phone the day before, just to break the terrible news about her ex-husband's death and to see if she had any idea who might have done this. Christine hadn't had any specific ideas about who would want to hurt Don, but she had mentioned that he used to have a big problem with road rage. She pointed out that he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so maybe, she suggested, he had gotten into some kind of confrontation with another driver on the highway, and maybe they had gotten angry enough to follow him home. But she also said their daughter Sienna had been with him for the whole drive, and Sienna hadn't mentioned anything like that happening. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had told her his dog Buddy was acting really skittish and scared when he had gotten back from the road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine herself as a suspect. She had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at her house around 7:45 on the night he was killed, and Christine and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together, at home. Her road rage theory seemed about as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but it wasn't particularly helpful in identifying a suspect right now. But Kaplan was back at Christine's house today because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry. Terry had been out of town for work the night before. He was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Dawn's ex-wife, he was a natural person of interest. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite, easy smile. Kaplan entered the living room where Christine and Sienna were sitting. He said a quick hello to them and then asked if they could leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in a big armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed very calm, almost relaxed, and he was friendly as he told the detective that he and Dawn didn't really have much contact with each other. He said their relationship wasn't exactly bad, it was just awkward. He explained it was because of the very difficult custody battle Dawn had had with Christine a few years back. Ever since then, Terry said he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Dawn as much as possible. He said he knew that Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked some kind of conflict with Dawn, Sienna would likely take her dad's side, and he didn't want that. As for the night of Dawn's murder, Terry told Kaplan that he was at his sister's house until about 9 o'clock that evening. Then he left her place and stopped at a Wendy's on his way to work to grab a burger. After that, he said he took a nap in the cab of his truck in the company parking lot before going in for his overnight shift. After Kaplan left Terry and Christine's house, he went back to the station. He immediately called Terry's sister, and then he called Terry's boss at the trucking company. And they both confirmed Terry's story. His sister said he left her house around 9. His boss confirmed he clocked in for his shift later that night. It seemed that Terry's alibi was solid. And that meant Kaplan was right back to square one with no viable suspects. But while he was sitting at his desk, writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang. It was a call from one of Dawn's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her home security camera for the night of Dawn's murder. And she had found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence. He grabbed his keys and drove right over to the neighbor's house. She led him inside to her computer and pressed play on a video file. Kaplan leaned in close to the computer screen. He watched the grainy black and white footage. The camera was mounted on her house, and it showed the side of Dawn's townhouse shot from the top of her driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., which Kaplan knew was just a few minutes after Dawn and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a dark, hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure walked over and deliberately tipped over Dawn's trash can. Then the figure walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen, presumably hiding somewhere out of view. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn's truck pulling into the garage. Then it showed Dawn walking back out again to go pick up the overturned trash can. He set it upright, and then he walked back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in the camera's frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light start to dim, which meant the garage door was closing. But then, inexplicably, the light began to get bigger again, which meant the door must have started going back up. And at the exact same time, there were several brief flashes of light, like a strobe. And then, after those flashes, the light began to dim again, meaning the garage door finally closed all the way, eventually leaving the driveway in total darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video from the neighbor. Then he left her house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what he had just seen on that video. He stood inside of Dawn's empty garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand. He pressed the button to close the door. And as the heavy door began its descent, Kaplan walked closer and closer until he was standing almost directly underneath its path. And when he did that, all of a sudden, the door stopped. Kaplan had tripped the infrared safety sensor at the bottom. And as soon as he tripped that sensor, a light on the motor unit at the top of the garage flashed 3 times, just as the door not only stopped, but reversed direction and began going back up. It was clearly the system's safety feature. And once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he had seen in the neighbor's video. And he thought about that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage just moments before Dawn got home. And all at once, it was like the pieces of the puzzle just clicked into place. The suspect must have waited for Dawn to go inside. And then, as the garage door was closing, they must have tried to sneak into the garage. But when they did, they must have tripped that sensor. So, the door would have stopped, those lights would have flashed, and the door would have started to go back up again. But the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what was going on, must have rushed over to the control panel on the wall and quickly hit the button again to make the door shut all the way. It was a close call for the killer. And it meant Dawn was none the wiser that someone else was now in the garage with him. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage was, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on the security video. It was too grainy and the person was wearing a hood. But the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They must have known when he would be leaving to take Sienna to her mother's house, and they must have known approximately when he would be coming back home alone. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, wouldn't just ignore it and leave it for the morning. They knew he would deal with it right then and there. And while Dawn was down at the curb, busy with the trash can, that would give the killer the perfect opportunity to sneak into the garage undetected. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn, they had to have known him very, very well. Detective Kaplan spent the next several weeks speaking to absolutely everyone who knew Dawn. He talked to his coworkers, his friends from church, and his entire extended family. He even tracked down his first wife and the two kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said that they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad over the years. However, they said that wasn't true for some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan that the person he should really be investigating was Dawn's own brother, Dennis. They said that Dawn and Dennis had had a huge falling out about a year earlier. But somehow, right after Dawn's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Dawn's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over all of Dawn's affairs ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the rest of the family that he was just trying to be helpful. But Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January of 2017, nearly a month after Dawn was murdered, Detective Kaplan brought Dawn's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. Seated across the bare interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up. He was fidgety, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or just irritated about it because he was innocent and being hassled. Dennis told Kaplan that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015, a little over a year earlier. He said the family had reached an agreement about what to do with their dad's possessions. But Dawn had apparently violated that agreement by keeping one of their father's classic cars for himself instead of selling it and splitting the money like they had all agreed. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said he and Dawn were no longer on speaking terms at all. Dennis claimed that he had reached out to Dawn that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Dawn never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that at some point they could patch things up if they just tried a little bit harder. But then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Dawn was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished his explanation. He didn't really buy the whole reconciliation story. And Dennis's only alibi for the night of the murder was that he was home alone. That wasn't an alibi at all. So, Kaplan decided to push him a little harder. He asked Dennis why he had started rooting through Dawn's house the very minute the crime scene tape came down. At this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to go through his brother's things themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Dawn's affairs had actually led him to a new lead about the murder, a lead that he wanted Kaplan to look into. He said that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Don's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, just standing there inside, with no good explanation for what he was doing. Dennis said he had heard from Don's neighbors that Don and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole in the ceiling that the landlord was supposed to repair, but hadn't gotten around to yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into an active crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair. He remembered Benny Ruiz showing up at the house on the day Don's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence at all, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Don. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself from the very beginning. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz, the landlord, into the station for an interview. Just like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. He said he was at home. But he did have an explanation for why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed Don's dog Buddy because nobody else was looking after the poor animal during the first few chaotic days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there was one person he should really be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived from out of town, he had been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse just a few blocks away from Don's. And Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it. He said he wanted to move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this whole thing very strange. When he ran a routine background check on Dennis, he discovered that he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no, he couldn't rent the place. Now, Kaplan already knew about Dennis's criminal record because he had run his name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of complete estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in taking over his brother's life and raising his daughter. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer. But there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don Fluitt as a loving father and a man of faith, a man who had completely reformed himself after some serious mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with him over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off years ago. And both she and her new husband, Terry, had alibis that seemed to check out. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. There just didn't seem to be anybody in his life who truly wanted Don dead. In February, about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article about the case. The headline said that the police had no suspects and no solid evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit to himself that it was more or less the truth. The investigation had hit a wall. The breakthrough that Detective Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, a full 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the state forensics lab. They told him that the results from a key piece of evidence had just come in, and the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on all the forensic evidence, the dozens of interviews, and the police investigation, here is what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of the 28th of December 2016. The killer waited in the darkness, right outside of Don's house, until the garage door opened at about 7:40 in the evening. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter Sienna in the truck. And as soon as they were gone, the killer darted forward, tipped over the heavy plastic garbage can at the end of the driveway, and then retreated back into the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a very long time. It annoyed them that everyone in town seemed to think that Don was so great that he was some kind of saint. Because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been a drug-abusing loser with 2 older kids that he didn't even seem to care for, and another one, Sienna, who he deserved to lose. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it. But finally, they had had enough. Dawn was just a dark cloud, constantly hovering over their life, and he had to go. The killer knew Dawn well enough to have his schedule figured out. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's house that evening. They knew he'd be coming home alone after that. And they knew that before he went to bed, he would almost always go out into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand. It's a small, heavy wooden bat that truckers use to check their tire pressure. And as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 o'clock, Dawn's truck came down the street. He pulled into the garage. And just as the killer had planned, while Dawn was out at the curb fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind the neighbor's SUV as Dawn walked back up the driveway and pressed the button to close the garage door, and then went inside his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into a better position to ambush Dawn. And as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door's safety sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those little lights flashing. Thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to force the garage door to close. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement from inside the townhouse that would suggest Dawn had heard the noise and was coming out to check. But Dawn didn't seem to notice. The killer breathed out a quiet sigh of relief and took their position near the interior door, waiting in the dark. After a while, the doorknob jiggled. The killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon. And as soon as Dawn opened the door and stepped into the garage, they struck him in the head so hard that the wooden tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Dawn again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage and resentment they had been pushing down for so long. Dawn did everything he could to fight back. He was a strong man, and he was fighting for his life. He had turned his whole life around. He had a daughter that he loved more than anything, a daughter he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here in his garage. And so, as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer, scratching and clawing. But he had been gravely injured in the initial attack. And when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck to hide. But the killer was relentless. They pulled him out and landed one last brutal punch to his face. Dawn stopped moving. And at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat, and they squeezed and squeezed until he went limp. But the killer still wasn't done. To make absolutely sure that Dawn was dead, they went back into Dawn's apartment, they grabbed a large knife from a butcher block in the kitchen, and they came back into the garage. They knelt down next to Dawn's body and ruthlessly slit his throat. Blood ran out of the wound and began to pool on the concrete floor. The killer then found some bleach under the sink inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could. But in their haste, they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Dawn was not able to save his own life that night. But by aggressively fighting back against his attacker, he had given investigators the one clue that would eventually solve his murder. And he would also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would be able to grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind, the evidence that solved the entire case, was a tiny speck of DNA found under Dawn's fingernails. And that DNA belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's house until 9 o'clock that night was a lie. His sister had covered for him. And so on the 3rd of April 2017, just over 3 months after Dawn's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. After his arrest, Terry tried to cast blame on his wife, Christine, Dawn's ex-wife. He claimed that she was the one who had put him up to it, that she had manipulated him into killing Dawn so that they could have Sienna all to themselves and stop dealing with the custody arrangement. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder. But the charges against her were eventually dropped due to a complete lack of evidence. There was nothing to tie her to the crime except the word of her killer husband. Terry White, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 12 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the freezing night of the 3rd of January 1804, 22-year-old Thomas Millwood sat inside a crowded pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling thoroughly annoyed. Normally, Thomas was an upbeat, social young man. He worked hard as a local bricklayer, and every day after his grueling shift, he would meet his friends at this tavern to drink ale, share stories, and laugh. But tonight, everything irritated him. As his friends droned on about the latest drama gripping their town, Thomas snapped. He slammed his pewter beer mug onto the table with a loud crash. The pub went dead silent. Realizing he had overreacted, Thomas muttered an embarrassed apology, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the exit. Just as he opened the door, his friends called out with genuine concern, "Hey, be careful you call it there, Thomas." Thomas rolled his eyes, muttered a dismissive, "Yeah, okay," and stepped into the bitter winter night. Thomas decided to walk to his parents' house nearby to warm up by the fire before meeting his wife. She worked late hours at a local estate, and Thomas always escorted her home safely. As he turned onto Black Lion Lane, the streets were entirely deserted. This was unusual for Hammersmith, a bustling town of 45,000 residents just outside London. Lately, however, a suffocating fear had settled over the community. For 2 months, a string of bizarre sightings and violent late-night attacks had left residents terrified to step outside after dark. Thomas thought the panic was absolute nonsense. He had done his best to ignore the gossip, but escaping it was becoming impossible. As he rounded a dark corner, he nearly collided with 2 men walking in the opposite direction. Startled, Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but one of the men shrieked, "Get back!" One man brandished a heavy wooden club, while the other gripped a pistol in his waistband. Thomas immediately threw his hands up to show he was not a threat. Relaxing their stance, the man with the club warned, "It's dangerous to be out here alone. You shouldn't be out by yourself." Before Thomas could reply, they hurried past him into the shadows. Thomas shook his head, thoroughly annoyed by the encounter. Reaching his parents' house, he found the front door securely bolted. He knocked loudly, and a moment later his sister Anne approached from the other side. "Who's there?" she called out anxiously. "It's me, Anne," Thomas replied. "Step back from the door so I can see you through the peephole," she insisted. Thomas groaned, but complied. Once Anne verified his identity, she unlocked the door, pulled him inside, and immediately locked it behind him. Her very first question was, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas instantly regretted coming. It didn't matter where you went in Hammersmith, everyone was obsessed with the attacks. The townspeople were absolutely convinced that a malevolent ghost was haunting them. The hysteria had begun 2 months earlier when a white figure was spotted in the church cemetery. It was soon discovered that the figure was just the butcher's son dressing up in women's clothing as a prank. But the panic didn't stop. A week later, a chimney sweep claimed he saw a phantom vanish into the graveyard dirt. Then, the physical attacks began. A pregnant woman was choked by a pale figure before escaping. A carriage driver was confronted by a creature with horns, causing him to abandon his horses and passengers. By late December, terror gripped the entire town. Thomas tried to convince his family that a ghost couldn't physically choke people, it had to be a human prankster using the rumors as a cover. But logic failed when a heavily pregnant woman died following an assault. She claimed a figure in a white robe and a pointed hat rose from the ground and grabbed her. She fainted from terror and died shortly after being found by neighbors. Following her death, the town offered a massive financial reward to anyone who could capture or kill the Hammersmith ghost. Citizens formed armed vigilante groups, completely consumed by panic. Inside his parents' home, Thomas sat by the fire, drifting off to sleep. Looking at the frost on the window, he dreaded going back into the freezing cold. He suggested to Anne that he might just sleep on the floor and let his wife walk home alone. Anne exploded. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted. "She will be the next victim of the ghost. Get out there and protect your wife." Thomas groaned, grabbed his jacket, and stepped back into the night. His frustration boiled over. He decided that if he ran into this ghost, he would sprint straight at him and beat him up to prove to the entire town that it was just a man. Marching briskly down Black Lion Lane, Thomas noticed a massive bush on the sidewalk. He stopped and squinted. Behind the branches, a dark figure was crouched low, trying to hide. Thomas's heart raced with adrenaline. This is the prankster, he thought. Without hesitation, Thomas balled his hands into fists and launched into a full sprint toward the bush. At that exact moment, Anne was looking out her window and heard a loud, agonizing male scream. Terrified that her brother was being attacked, she bolted outside. Minutes later, a large posse of men burst out of the pub Thomas had left earlier. They were led by Francis Smith, the town's mild-mannered tax collector. Francis looked completely unhinged, out of breath, and terrified. He led the armed men down Black Lion Lane, where they suddenly froze. Lying in the dirt road was a motionless body. Crouched over the corpse was a dark, shadowy figure. As the posse approached, the figure whipped its head around and let out a blood-curdling shriek of grief. The night watchman rushed forward, tackling the dark figure to the ground. The rest of the men ran to the body, assuming they had found the ghost's latest victim. They were tragically wrong. The person hiding behind the bush had been Francis Smith. He wasn't the ghost, he was a terrified citizen waiting to ambush the spirit for the reward. The tragedy came down to Thomas's clothing. As a bricklayer, Thomas wore his work uniform, stark white linen trousers, a white jacket, and a white apron. To Francis, crouching in the dark and primed to see a phantom, a figure in all white charging at him out of the shadows, was a nightmare. Panicking, Francis raised his shotgun and fired. The blast hit Thomas squarely in the face, killing him instantly. The monstrous dark figure cradling Thomas's body was just his sister Anne, wearing a dark shawl, weeping over her dead brother. The tragedy shocked England. On the 11th of January 1804, Francis Smith was tried for murder. The jury, knowing he acted out of genuine terror, tried to find him guilty of manslaughter. However, the judge ruled that mistake of fact was no defense for murder. Smith was sentenced to hang. Recognizing the lack of malice, King George III intervened 5 weeks later, commuting Smith's sentence to just 1 year of hard labor. Soon after, the town's shoemaker confessed to being the true Hammersmith ghost. He had used the disguise to terrify his apprentices as revenge for telling scary ghost stories to his children. The case was debated for over 150 years. Ultimately, the tragic death of Thomas Millwood led to modern self-defense laws, establishing that a person is legally permitted to use force if they honestly and reasonably believe they are in imminent danger, even if they are completely mistaken. On the freezing night of the 3rd of January 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside a crowded neighborhood pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling completely and utterly annoyed. Under normal circumstances, Thomas was a remarkably upbeat, cheerful, and highly social person. He worked hard as a local bricklayer, and basically every single day after his grueling physical shift ended, he would head straight to this local tavern to meet up with his closest friends. Together, they would have some drinks, share rowdy stories, and laugh away the exhaustion of the day. It was their daily ritual, and it was always a great time. But tonight, it was like everything under the sun annoyed Thomas. He found himself especially irritated by his friends. As they droned on and on, obsessing over the current drama going on in their small town, Thomas felt a hot surge of impatience rising in his chest. He finally just had enough. Before he could stop himself, he stood up abruptly and slammed his heavy pewter beer mug down onto the wooden table with a resounding crash. Right away, Thomas knew he had severely overdone it. The moment the mug struck the wood, the entire pub went deadly silent. The chatter died, his friends all stopped talking mid-sentence, and absolutely everybody in the room turned to look directly at him. Feeling a wave of embarrassment, Thomas kind of muttered a hasty apology and then quickly grabbed his heavy winter coat. He stood up and just began walking toward the exit, desperately wanting to leave the pub. The tavern remained totally silent as he walked across the floor. Then, right as he was about to step out the door and into the street, his friends finally broke the tense silence. They called out to him, their voices laced with genuine anxiety, and said, "Hey, be careful out there." Thomas didn't turn around to look back. He just rolled his eyes, muttered a dismissive, "Yeah, okay," and then he went outside into the bitter, biting cold. Thomas decided he would walk over to his parents' house, which was located not very far away. His plan was simple. He would just sit by their fireplace and warm up for a little bit before he had to go back out later that night to meet up with his wife. His wife worked incredibly long hours at a local estate, and she often worked quite late into the night. Whenever she worked late, Thomas made it a strict rule to walk to her workplace, meet her when her shift ended, and personally escort her back home to ensure she was safe. That was exactly what he was planning on doing tonight, but he had some time to kill beforehand. As Thomas began walking briskly down Black Lion Lane, he noticed that, per usual, he was basically one of the only people outside. Hammersmith used to be a very friendly, lively, and bustling place. It was home to roughly 45,000 residents and was located right on the prosperous outskirts of London. In fact, it was so beautiful that lots of rich people liked to go there just to vacation. But recently, the entire atmosphere of the town had completely changed. There had been a string of increasingly bizarre late-night sightings and violent encounters or attacks, as the frantic townspeople were calling them. This ongoing phenomenon had all the residents completely on edge, to the agonizing point where people were flat out refusing to go outside after the sun went down. Now, Thomas thought the entire situation was totally ridiculous. In his mind, people were completely overreacting to shadows and rumors. Because of this, he had been doing his absolute best to ignore the endless drama going on in town, but it was getting harder and harder to do that. As Thomas rounded a dark corner on the lane, the reality of the town's panic smacked him right in the face. He nearly walked directly into two men who were walking the opposite direction. When Thomas looked up to apologize for almost colliding with them, one of the men shrieked in absolute terror, "Get back!" Thomas blinked in shock. In the dim light, he saw that the man who shouted was holding a heavy wooden club tightly in his hand, raising it defensively. The other guy had a loaded pistol tucked into his waist, and his hand was clamped firmly onto the pistol grip, ready to draw and fire. Thomas instinctively threw both of his hands up into the air to show he was completely unarmed and was not a threat. At that point, seeing that he was just a regular young man, the first man slowly lowered his club, and the other guy took his hand off his pistol grip. One of them looked at Thomas, his voice trembling, and said, "Hey, it's dangerous to be out here alone." "You should not be out here by yourself." Before Thomas could even say anything back to them, the two men quickly walked past him, quickened their pace, and completely disappeared around the dark corner. By now, Thomas was only a few houses away from his parents' home. He just kind of brushed off the unsettling incident, speed-walked the rest of the way, and mentally cursed the two men under his breath for their ridiculous, paranoid warning about how dangerous it was out here. A minute later, Thomas arrived at his parents' house. He walked up to the front door, expecting it to be open because normally his parents kept the door unlocked for family. But when he tried the knob tonight, it was firmly locked. He knocked loudly. A second later, he heard the cautious footsteps of his sister Anne coming toward the door inside the house. She called out warily through the thick wood, "Who's there?" Thomas groaned. "It's me, Anne." But apparently, just hearing his voice was not enough to satisfy her. Anne called back through the door, "Well, I don't know if it's really you, so back up so I can see your whole person through the peephole." Thomas rolled his eyes in exasperation, but he did exactly what his sister asked. He stepped back several feet into the cold street and allowed her to inspect his entire body through the small viewing hole. At that point, he finally heard Anne fumbling frantically with the heavy iron lock. The door was unlocked, and she opened it up. Thomas stepped inside, and his sister immediately shut and locked the door securely behind him. Her very first question to Thomas wasn't a greeting. She just looked at him and asked, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas immediately wished he had not come to his parents' house at all. He had walked all this way specifically to avoid talking about this stupid, exhausting topic, but he quickly realized that if he had gone back to his own house, he likely would have gotten the exact same question from his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife. The truth was, it didn't really seem to matter where you went in Hammersmith or who you talked to. The conversation was always going to be exactly the same. It was always going to be about these late-night attacks, because the people of Hammersmith were absolutely, unshakably convinced that these crimes were being committed by a literal ghost. The entire mass hysteria had started about 2 months earlier, in November, when somebody spotted a mysterious, pale figure lurking ominously in the church cemetery. Thomas firmly believed the panic should have stopped right then and there, because only a couple of days after that initial sighting, the truth was figured out. It was discovered that the figure was actually just the local butcher's son. He had just been dressing up in women's clothes and walking around in the cemetery purely as a prank to scare his friends. It was a joke. A prank. That was it. But the terror in town did not go away. A week after this first weird sighting, there was another, more sinister sighting in the exact same cemetery. A local chimney sweep claimed he saw someone walking around in the graveyard who literally disappeared straight into the ground. Admittedly, a lot of the more level-headed people in Hammersmith brushed that second sighting off as just pure imagination and hysteria. But it was right after this second sighting that the so-called attacks began in town. Late one night, a resident was walking past the cemetery perimeter when something rushed up silently behind them and began violently choking them. This resident was somehow able to break free from the grip and run away to safety, but as they fled, they turned and got a clear look at whatever was attacking them. They described the assailant as a terrifying phantom. Shortly after that, a local carriage driver was navigating his vehicle past the cemetery when he had to get out for some reason. Suddenly, a horrific creature with literal horns on its head came charging out of the darkness and confronted the driver. The driver was so overwhelmed by fear that he turned and ran away on foot, completely abandoning his 8 horses and his 16 passengers to fend for themselves. By late December, there had been so many more of these strange attacks and weird sightings that basically every single person in Hammersmith, save for Thomas, was totally gripped by a paralyzing fear. As terror spread like wildfire across the town, Thomas had repeatedly attempted to convince his wife, his mother-in-law, and his family that there was just no physical way this was a real ghost. He argued constantly that it was nothing more than people's paranoia and their imaginations running wild. But Thomas's logical theory was put into serious question when just a few days earlier, somebody actually died following one of these attacks. And it wasn't just anyone. A pregnant woman had died. The woman had been walking alone near the church cemetery at about 10 o'clock at night when something in the graveyard rose up out of the ground, rushed over to her, and grabbed onto her tightly. She barely had time to turn and look, catching only a glimpse of a white flowing robe and a long, pointed white hat before she fainted from sheer terror. When she woke up again, she was inside a neighbor's house, surrounded by worried citizens who had found her passed out in the dirt and carried her inside. She came to, but she was only able to choke out the terrifying story of what had happened to her, the story of the ghost attack, before her body gave out, and she died. Following the tragic death of this pregnant woman, the town of Hammersmith officially offered a massive financial reward for anybody who could capture or kill the entity, which was now being dubbed the Hammersmith Ghost. The night watchmen began doing extra patrols every single hour. In fact, those 2 men Thomas had bumped into earlier, the guy with the club and the guy with the gun, were on their own citizen patrol. The ghost, and how to capture or kill it, was basically the only thing people in Hammersmith wanted to talk about. It was what was being discussed at the pub by his friends when Thomas got so mad that he slammed his cup down and left. To Thomas, the very idea of capturing or killing a ghost made absolutely no sense, because ghosts simply aren't real. By this point, the butcher's son had even come forward publicly and said, "Look, I didn't do any of these other attacks. That's not me. I only did the very first one." He even had a rock-solid alibi to prove it. But to Thomas, this didn't rule out that the ghost was a physical person. To Thomas, it just meant there was somebody else in town who was actively copying the butcher's son's prank, except they had obviously taken the jokes way too far because they had gotten someone killed. At about 10 o'clock, Thomas was sitting comfortably inside his parents' house by the fire, just beginning to doze off. As he sat there in the warmth, he thought to himself how little he wanted to go back out into the freezing cold night just to walk with his wife all the way back home. He honestly would have much rather just stayed right here, slept on the floor for the night, and let his wife walk home on her own. But when he floated this lazy idea to his sister Anne, who was standing nearby, she completely exploded on him. "Are you kidding me?" she shouted. "You're gonna let your wife walk home alone in this terrifying environment? She's going to be the next victim of the Hammersmith ghost. Get out there right now and protect your wife." Thomas held up his hands defensively. Okay, he muttered. He reluctantly got up, grabbed his jacket, and walked back outside into the freezing air. The moment Thomas stepped outside, he felt a massive wave of frustration. He was feeling so intensely annoyed at the current situation that a reckless, angry thought formed in his head. You know what? If I run into that stupid Hammersmith ghost tonight, the person disguised as a ghost, I am going to bum rush them and beat them up. It will prove to this entire cowardly town, once and for all, that there was never any ghost, and that it was just a regular person the whole time. Fueled by anger, Thomas began walking briskly down the road. He turned onto Black Lion Lane, and almost immediately his eyes caught something. Off to the side of the road, right on the sidewalk, was a massive bush. Thomas could have sworn that behind this bush there was something or someone crouched down low, like they were deliberately trying to hide in the shadows. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. He squinted hard through the darkness in the direction of the bush. As he watched, he saw a distinct movement, just enough to confirm to him that there was absolutely a human being hiding back there. Suddenly, everything clicked perfectly for Thomas. That must be the person pretending to be the ghost, he thought. That's the prankster. That's the murderer. There they are. Without a single second of hesitation, Thomas balled up his fists, locked his eyes on the bush, and launched into a full-blown sprint directly toward the hidden person. At virtually the exact same time, back inside the house, Anne was standing near the window, looking out roughly in the direction that her brother had gone. Suddenly, cutting through the quiet night air, she heard a loud, agonizing scream that sounded distinctly like a man. She couldn't see her brother from where she stood, but a horrific thought hit her. Oh my God, that's coming from the exact area where he went. What if he's getting attacked by the ghost? Terrified for his life, she bolted out the front door and ran into the darkness. Just a couple of minutes after that, a massive, rowdy posse of men came tumbling out of the very pub where Thomas had been drinking earlier that night. They came stumbling out into the cold, but they were not being led by the night watchman, even though a watchman was present in the crowd. Instead, they were being led by the town's mild-mannered tax collector, a man named Francis Smith. Francis looked completely disheveled, entirely out of breath, and frantic. He did not look at all like the type of guy who would be leading a big angry posse, but here he was. He led the men down the road at a full run, and they turned the corner onto Black Lion Lane. The moment the posse looked down the lane, they stopped dead in their tracks. Lying right in the middle of the dirt road was a human body, and it didn't appear to be moving at all. Crouched directly over the body was a dark, shadowy figure, hunched low over the torso. The figure suddenly turned, looked straight at the approaching posse, and let out an unbelievable, blood-curdling shriek. The men in the posse backed up in pure terror, completely unsure of what to do. But the night watchman suddenly broke ranks.
he began sprinting directly at the creature that was perched over the body. He threw his weight forward, tackled the figure hard onto the ground, and pinned them tightly to the earth. At the same time, seeing that the threat was pinned, the rest of the posse rushed over to the body in the road to see if the victim was still alive and if there was any way they could help. But unfortunately, the moment they looked down at the body, they could tell the person was already dead. The posse genuinely believed they had just discovered the latest tragic victim of the Hammersmith ghost, and that they had successfully captured the ghost itself, the black creature the watchman had tackled onto the ground. But they were completely wrong. When Thomas had rounded the corner onto Black Lion Lane and looked into that bush, the figure moving around really was a living human being. It was Francis Smith, the tax collector. However, Francis was not hiding behind that bush because he was pretending to be the Hammersmith ghost, which was what Thomas had assumed when he charged him. Instead, Francis was hiding behind that bush because he was actively laying in wait for the ghost. He was hoping the spirit would walk past his hiding spot so he could run out, capture or kill it, and claim the town's reward. Basically, Francis was trying to do the exact same thing Thomas was doing. The only difference was that Francis actually believed in the ghost, and Thomas did not. It was just Thomas's horrific bad luck that, on that specific night, he had chosen to wear his everyday work clothes. Because he was a bricklayer, his uniform consisted of a stark, all-white jacket, white trousers, and a white apron. To Francis, who was crouching behind the bush, terrified and desperately waiting for a phantom dressed in white robes, seeing a figure in all white suddenly sprint out of the darkness directly at him was his worst nightmare. When the two men spotted each other, they both attacked. Except Francis was armed with a shotgun. As Thomas ran up to the bush to punch him in the face, Francis panicked, raised his gun, and pulled the trigger. The blast hit Thomas directly in the face and throat, killing him instantly. But even after shooting him, Francis had absolutely no idea he had just killed a real person. He was so incredibly jacked up on adrenaline and terror that he thought he had shot the actual ghost, but he was too afraid to check the body alone. He ran straight to the pub, gathered the posse, and said, "Hey, I got the ghost!" "Come on!" When they all ran back to Black Lion Lane, Thomas's sister Anne had already made it to the scene. She was the creature crouched over the body, screaming out of pure, unadulterated grief. She had just found her dead brother and was reacting to the horror when the watchman mistakenly tackled her to the ground. Luckily, the posse quickly realized their mistake, and Anne was not harmed. On the 11th of January, 1804, Francis Smith was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. However, recognizing the total lack of malice and the genuine element of terror involved, the King of England intervened 5 weeks later, pardoning Francis and shortening his sentence to just 1 year of hard labor. The true identity of the subsequent Hammersmith ghost attacks was later revealed to be the town's shoemaker, who confessed to the crimes out of guilt following Thomas's murder. He admitted he only did it to terrify his apprentices as revenge because they had scared his own children with ghost stories. The legal fallout of the Hammersmith ghost incident was fiercely debated in courts for more than 150 years. Ultimately, this bizarre tragedy led to a foundational, modern-day legal ruling which states that a person is legally allowed to use force in self-defense if they truly and reasonably believe they are in imminent danger, even if they are completely mistaken about the danger they actually face. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.
We often think of danger as something obvious, like a dark alleyway in a bad part of town or a steep cliff edge during a storm. We think we can see it coming, and we believe that as long as we make sensible decisions, we will be perfectly fine. But the truth is that sometimes the most terrifying dangers are the ones that are completely hidden in plain sight, lurking in places that seem entirely peaceful or even fun. A beautiful beach where the sand seems solid as concrete, a calm river winding through a picturesque town, or a beloved amusement park where families go to laugh and make memories. In these places, a single split-second decision, a minor oversight, or just a few moments of bad timing can transform an ordinary day into an absolute nightmare. When these moments happen, the victims usually have no idea they are walking directly into a trap until it is far too late. Today, we are going to look at 3 stories of people who went into places they thought were completely safe, only to find themselves facing a reality that was far more terrifying than they ever could have imagined. On Monday, the 23rd of May 2005, 37-year-old John Wilson got home from an extremely long and exhausting day at work. John was an oil pipeline inspector in Houston, Texas, and that day it had been incredibly hot. He spent the entire day driving around to all these different job sites, standing out in the sun, and dealing with the pressure of keeping everything running safely. He really had not had a break all day, and so now that he was home, he was totally exhausted. Every logical part of his brain told him that he should probably just go straight to bed. But the problem was, John did not want to. He did not want to just go right to bed and then have to get back up again and go right back to work. He wanted to unwind and do something he truly enjoyed before calling it a night. And so, John decided that what he would do to unwind would be to go fishing, which was something he really loved to do. Normally, John did a lot of freshwater fishing in the lakes and ponds around Houston, but tonight he decided he would do some saltwater fishing. At about 7:30 that night, he walked out to his garage, grabbed his favorite fishing rod and his tackle box, threw them in the back of his pickup truck, and then he hit the road. About an hour and a half later, John had driven all the way south to the very coast of Texas to a beach called Crystal Beach, which is located right on the Gulf of Mexico. Instead of parking in one of the parking spaces in the lot, John did what he always did. He drove his pickup truck right through the gate and out onto the actual beach. This beach actually had a reputation for having extremely hard-packed sand, almost like cement, because so many people like to drive their vehicles out onto the shore. John drove straight out towards the water, enjoying the open space and the cool night air. Although the tide was not completely low yet, it was slowly making its way towards low tide, which meant there was a lot of dry beach exposed. John drove for quite a while and then he parked. He positioned his truck still in the tidal zone, but well away from the water. John probably figured that he would not be there long enough for it to matter because high tide was not for several hours. And so John hopped out of his truck, prepped his fishing rod, and walked out into the actual surf. He cast his line and began to fish. It would have been very, very peaceful down there. There was not really anyone else on the beach, as it was pretty much the middle of the night. There might have been a couple of other fishermen way down the shoreline, but that was about it. For a while, John probably just enjoyed the peace and quiet, focusing on the rhythmic sound of the waves. But after a while, John got overwhelmingly tired. Maybe it was from all the hard work earlier in the day out in the sun that was finally catching up to him, or maybe it was all the moving around in the surf, getting knocked around by the water that was making him tired, or maybe it was both. But either way, John decided he wanted to take a short nap before he headed home again. He did not want to sleep in the cab of his truck because it was too hot and stuffy, and he wanted to enjoy the cool sea breeze. So, he left the surf zone, dropped his fishing rod in the back of his truck, and then he crawled underneath his truck to take a nap on the sand, using the chassis as a shield from the damp night air. The following morning, a man who was out for a walk near Crystal Beach looked out into the water and saw a pickup truck half submerged in the surf zone. He immediately knew something was wrong, so he called the police. When the police arrived, they realized they could not easily get to the truck, so they called a tow truck. The tow truck driver showed up to the beach, but when he got there, it was still relatively high tide. He had to wait for a couple of hours until the tide went down enough that he could actually walk out, attach the chains, and start pulling this truck out of the surf zone. Finally, when it was low tide enough, the tow truck driver walked down to the truck, but as soon as he was standing next to this partially submerged vehicle, his heart sank. He saw there was a body poking out from underneath the truck, and that body belonged to John Wilson. No one knows for sure what happened to John after he climbed underneath his truck, but the best guess is that after he went under there, he fell into a very deep sleep and slept for much longer than he anticipated. In that time frame, even though the sand of this beach had a reputation for being really, really hard, something critical changed. As the tide slowly began to turn and rise, the water started to seep up through the sand from below. When water mixes with packed sand, it causes the sand to lose its solid structure and behave like a liquid, a process known as liquefaction. Over a couple of hours, his heavy truck would have begun to sink into the softening sand. It settled lower and lower, and so John, as he was laying there, at some point would have been trapped by the underside of his truck. From that point, either the truck just continued to settle, ultimately crushing John to death, or it kept him pinned there while he was still alive, and then the tide came in, and eventually he drowned. Either way, John's final moments must have been absolute torture, and a peaceful night of fishing ended in unspeakable horror. Our next story takes us to Sevnica, which is a gorgeous town right in the heart of Slovenia. It is situated right along the scenic Sava River, which is one of the longest and most beautiful rivers in all of Europe. For decades, the section of the Sava River that flows past Sevnica was a highly popular destination for kayakers and canoeists who love to paddle through the calm, peaceful waters. But that all changed in 2008 when a massive hydroelectric dam was built across the river. This dam created a complete dead end for anyone trying to go through that section of the river. Boaters would have to stop at the dam, get out of their boats, walk all the way around the massive concrete structure, and then pick up the river on the other side. For many locals, this marked the end of a long and beloved tradition. In 2008, while this dam was still under construction, the mayor of Sevnica, who was a strong supporter of the dam's construction, understood that this was a bit of a bummer for the people in town. While the dam itself was going to provide a lot of clean electricity for the community, it did mark the end of an era. And so he decided he would organize a final historic trip down the Sava River past the dam while they could still go right past it. He was calling this trip the Final Descent. He went all around town, talking to local leaders and residents, asking if they wanted to join him on this final journey. He eventually recruited 27 other people to come with him, making a total group of 28 eager participants. A few weeks later, on the 3rd of July 2008, after all the preparations were completed, the mayor and the rest of his crew made their way upstream to a loading area where 4 large canoes had been set out for them. The staff people who had actually provided these canoes offered the group life jackets, but remarkably, virtually everyone in the group turned them down. It is unclear why they refused the life jackets, but one could guess that because the river itself was incredibly calm and smooth, and because they were not expecting to be on the water for very long, they simply decided they did not need them. They felt perfectly safe. And so, after all 28 people got into their canoes, with exactly 7 people per canoe, they pushed off the shore and began their slow, peaceful trip down the river. The mayor had even hired a professional photographer to come along with them to document their journey. As soon as they took off, the photographer was looking around, taking pictures, and filming the group. The weather was beautiful, the water was completely calm, and everything was going perfectly. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their journey, the canoes turned a corner and they got a clear view of the massive dam, which was about 1,000 feet away from them at the time. Now, the dam was not completely finished yet, but it was pretty close to being done. The actual concrete structure was built, and even from 1,000 feet away, it was very obvious that up ahead, there were these big cement archways where the river water flowed down over the dam. The whole group pretty much immediately saw they had a problem. The plan, according to what the mayor had told everyone, was that they would get to this dam, but on the left side, there was going to be a strip of waterway that had not been blocked off yet. Because the dam was not fully complete, the construction crew had told the mayor that there would be an area on the left side where they could basically just casually float right past. They would not have to go down the dam, and it would be totally safe. But here they were, on the water, looking at the dam, and even from 1,000 feet away, it was obvious there was no side way to get around the structure. The dam went from one bank to the other, completely blocking the river. They clearly had to go through the dam, or they had to get out of the water and walk around it. Now, the river was moving very, very slowly, and there was not a strong current. This meant there was no urgent, panic-induced decision that needed to be made. The group intuitively knew that the right choice here was to go to the side of the river, get out of their canoes, and either carry their boats around or just end the trip right there. But the mayor and a few of the other people in the leading canoes got another idea. They looked at the dam and thought, why don't we just go over it? I know we are not supposed to, and the construction crew explicitly said not to go over it because it is extremely dangerous, but from the looks of it, it does not look that bad. And truthfully, to an untrained eye, it did not look too bad. This was not some massive waterfall or an enormous dam with a huge drop-off. It was actually a pretty small dam where the water went down a fairly short concrete embankment. It was maybe 10 or 15 feet long, and at the bottom of this embankment, the water was a little bit rough and foaming, but overall, it looked like it might actually be fun. It looked like going down a giant slide with a canoe. And so, the mayor was really keen on doing this. He made it seem like it was going to be an exciting adventure, a perfect highlight for their final descent. Before long, the people in 3 of the 4 canoes were fully on board with the idea of just going over the dam. The 4th canoe, which contained the photographer, was not prepared to go over. They said they were not comfortable with it, but they agreed to pull up next to the dam on the shore, get out, and film the other 3 canoes going over the side. They thought it would make for some incredible footage. After making their plans, the 4 canoes continued down the river. When they got about 100 or 200 feet away from the entrance to the dam, the 4th canoe with the photographer pulled off to the left side of the river. They got out, and the photographer lifted up his camera and began filming the other 3 canoes as they made their final approach. The video from this photographer, which was later released to the public, shows the first of these 3 canoes actually entering the dam structure. You can see the 7 people in this canoe looking happy and excited. They have a sense of nervous anticipation, like they are about to start a roller coaster ride. They make their way into the dark section inside the concrete archways, where they are going to go down the embankment. But as they go into the darkness and you begin to lose sight of them, you suddenly see the back end of the canoe pop straight up. This was because they had started sliding down the actual dam itself. They start sliding down, and then you hear someone in the canoe start to scream. And then the audio goes completely silent and the video just cuts off. What had happened was that as soon as that first canoe hit the churning water at the bottom of the slide, the violent currents immediately flipped the boat over, throwing all 7 people into the freezing water. They did not even have a chance to catch their breath before they were sucked under. This was not just because the water was rough and churning, but because this was a hydroelectric dam. At the bottom of the dam, underneath the water where they had been thrown, were all these massive openings to underwater tunnels. These tunnels functioned like incredibly powerful vacuums, pulling massive amounts of water down inside to run past the turbines, causing them to spin and generate electricity. Even though the dam was not fully operational yet, these tunnels and the turbines at the bottom of them were fully active. The suction was inescapable. As these 7 people were dumped into the water, they were dragged deep beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the other 2 canoes had no idea what was happening to the first boat. Because of the concrete walls and the roaring sound of the water, they could not see or hear the disaster. And so, they just continued on and went over the dam. The second canoe went down the slide and also immediately capsized at the bottom. All 7 of its occupants were thrown out and sucked down underwater almost instantly. The third canoe that went over the dam, however, did not capsize. By some miracle, they managed to stay upright. After they cleared the slide and paddled away from the turbulent foam, they began looking around for the other 2 canoes that should have already been down there. but there was nobody in front of them. They turned around, thinking maybe the others were closer to the dam. But then they saw the horrifying reality. One of the canoes was completely flipped over, and the other canoe had been violently broken apart in the churning waters right at the base of the dam. They saw shattered pieces of wood getting tumbled around in the foam. The occupants of this third canoe immediately turned around and tried to paddle over to the base of the dam to start pulling people out of the water. But when they got over there, there was no one to save. The 14 people who had been in those first two canoes had completely vanished. Ultimately, 13 of those 14 people would perish that day. The only person who fell into the water and survived was actually the mayor's wife. By some miracle, she managed to swim out of the powerful grasp of the underwater tunnels and made it to the shore. Over the next several days and weeks, police divers searched the river and eventually found all 13 bodies. One of the victims had been carried 25 miles away, all the way to Croatia. The public never knew if being sucked through the underwater turbines played a direct role in their deaths, but the tragedy left a permanent scar on the community, a painful reminder of a celebration that went horribly wrong. Our third and final story takes us back to the summer of 1974 in Anaheim, California. 18-year-old Debbie Stone had just graduated from high school and landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland, which was known as the happiest place on earth. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings, which had opened just 9 days prior. Disney had basically converted an old carousel building, which featured a floor that rotated in a giant circle, into a rotating stage show. They put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages. On each of these 6 stages, they placed different sets of robotic animals that played different songs about American history. The way this worked for the audience was that they would walk into a theater and sit down, and they would see one of these 6 stages right in front of them. The robotic animals would perform a short musical act, and then the entire stage would rotate, bringing the next stage in front of the audience. The audience would remain seated in their chairs until all 6 stages had rotated past them. Debbie's job at America Sings was to welcome the guests at the start of the show. She would walk out onto the stage, give a friendly introduction, and then step off as the show began. Once all 6 acts were finished, Debbie would walk back out onto the stage, say goodbye to the audience, and guide them toward the exit doors. It was a simple, fun job, and Debbie loved it. On the 9th of July, 1974, Debbie was asked to work an evening shift. She arrived at the attraction around 10 o'clock that night, right as a new show was starting. She went inside, hopped on stage, greeted the audience with her bright smile, and then stepped back into the wings as the show began. For the next 30 minutes, all 6 stages performed their acts. After the final performance was over, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage, said goodbye to the crowd, and then, as the audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Behind each of the 6 stages was a large circular room in the center of the building that was used for storage and maintenance. This center room was completely stationary. It did not move. The outer ring of stages and their tall back walls rotated directly around this stationary center room. The gap between the outside of this center room and the inside of the rotating back walls of the stages was extremely narrow, measuring only a couple of inches. It was a massive pinch point, and if a person got stuck back there, it would be highly dangerous. However, Disney had not put any physical safety guards, warning sensors, or emergency shutoff switches in place. They had simply told their staff to be careful and not to go back there. As Debbie walked toward the back of the stage that night, intending to move to the adjoining stage, something went terribly wrong. In the dim light, she either tripped, lost her balance, or misjudged her footing, and she fell directly into the narrow gap between the 2 back walls. Debbie was immediately wedged tightly between the stationary center wall and the back of one of the rotating stages. She tried desperately to pull herself out, but she was completely stuck. She began to panic and started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. But the timing was tragic. At that exact moment, a new crowd of loud, talking guests was walking into the theater, and the loud, cheerful theme music of the attraction began playing. Debbie's screams were completely drowned out. The new audience members in the front rows did hear a faint, muffled screaming sound, but they simply assumed it was a realistic sound effect or a pre-recorded part of the show. And then the automated system started, and the massive, heavy stages began to rotate. Because Debbie was trapped in the tiny gap, the physical force of the rotating stage was absolutely immense. As the stage began to turn, she was forcibly dragged, twisted, and rolled through the narrow space. Her bones began to break, and she suffered catastrophic internal injuries as the heavy machinery relentlessly forced her body through the gap. But remarkably, Debbie did not die instantly. When the stage finally finished its rotation and locked into place, she was still alive, trapped in the dark, and in absolute agony. She used every bit of strength she had left to continue screaming for help. But once again, the music was too loud, and everyone assumed the screams were part of the show. A few minutes later, the act was completed, and the stage rotated again, crushing and dragging Debbie's broken body a second time. It was only at the end of the entire show when a concerned guest finally alerted the staff about the persistent screaming that anyone went to check. They turned on the lights, looked into the gap, and discovered Debbie's lifeless body. The news of Debbie's tragic death sent shockwaves through the community and the theme park industry. Her family was completely devastated, unable to comprehend how their vibrant young daughter could have died in such a horrific manner at the happiest place on Earth. Disney ultimately reached a small financial settlement with Debbie's family. Following the tragedy, the America Sings attraction was closed for several days while engineers installed advanced safety sensors, physical barriers, and emergency cutoff switches to ensure that no human being could ever access that dangerous gap again. The ride eventually reopened, but the memory of that terrible night lingered in the minds of the staff for decades. These three tragic stories serve as a powerful and deeply sobering reminder of the fragile nature of human life. In every single one of these cases, the victims were completely ordinary people who were simply trying to enjoy their lives, work their jobs, or have a little bit of fun. None of them woke up that morning thinking they were embarking on their final day on Earth. John Wilson just wanted to relax by the ocean after a hard day of work. The mayor of Sevnica and his friends just wanted to celebrate their local river and have an adventure. Debbie Stone was just doing her job, welcoming families to a place of joy. But in each case, they fell victim to dangers that were completely hidden or severely underestimated. It is a reminder to always respect the environments we enter, to never take safety for granted, and to remember that danger can lurk in the most unexpected and peaceful places. After hearing stories like these, it's hard to look at safe places the same way again. If you're curious how deep that idea goes, there's more waiting for you on the channel. See you in the next one.